I worked overnight security in one of the largest, best, and oldest hospitals in the US. My fellow security officers and I all have stories about one building in particular, but the one that I'll tell is the one that happened to me. It was built in the late 1800s. It was the original psychiatric building for the hospital. Now, being the late 1800s, not much was truly known about psychiatric disorders. On top of that, this hospital was known for its medical research. With both of these facts combined, you can infer that some terrible stuff was done of these misunderstood psych patients in the building. A few years before I started working security there, this building had been converted into offices after the newly built part of the hospital dedicated a section for an updated psych ward. My rounds for that night happened to include said building. At night, this building was empty due to recently being converted into offices, and the drones who worked there wanting to leave promptly at 5, if not earlier, in some of their haste. They left their office doors unlocked, which is a big no-no due to medical information being located within them. It was our duty to go to each floor and make sure every door was locked, and if it wasn't, to secure it ourselves. I did my initial sweep of the building to make sure it was clear, and there was nobody in there, and proceeded to do my door checks. The hallways were pretty narrow, so I could check both sides of the hallway doors at once. At the end of this hallway, there were 2 sets of doors you had to go through to reach the final office, which was a dead end. Everything was secure. Awesome, time for the next floor. I exited the 2 sets of doors from the dead-end office and stood absolutely frozen from what I saw. Every door ajar, set perfectly, so their own weight wouldn't cause them to shut again, and one wheelchair at the end of said hallway facing towards the step. I had heard other security officers outright reject that set of rounds due to strange stuff happening there, but I laughed it off. Until that night happened. I never took those rounds again. The older children's ICU is currently under construction to be turned into medical labs, so we have to patrol the area. Once again, to make sure the area is secure, or to report if the contractor/foreman stayed to plan for the next day. While patrolling this area, several security officers have reported seeing a single white male child between the ages of 5 and 7, sporting short brown hair. Imagine a 90s bowl cut. I personally dismissed this, as this was before the psych ward incident, as a tall tale told with the intent to scare me because I was new at the time. I got to that building patrol one night, and a foreman who stayed late called security and asked for a security officer to come up because a kid had locked himself in a room and he didn't want him to get hurt with all the open wires, or something to that effect. I unlocked the door for him, looked in what can only be described as a 10 by 8 room for about 10 minutes, and there was no kid. Called it a false alarm and finished my patrol. I also had a special detail, aka babysitting a violent psych patient, along with another security officer. He woke up in the middle of the night, recognized the other officer and said hello. He sees me and immediately starts screaming at me not to hurt him. Now, I'm a rather large gentleman, standing at 6'2" and weighing 250 pounds, but I try not to make myself too intimidating around psych patients, as to not escalate the situation. Well, he keeps screaming for me not to hurt him, and he says if I promise not to, he would make something good happen to me. He promised. He calms down and goes back to sleep and I forget about it. Next day I got a permanent set of rounds and a pretty good promotion. Easily coincidence, but interesting nonetheless. This is my final encounter. A fellow security officer had rounds in the aforementioned psych building. Heard a call on the radio in what could only be described as dry throat of terror voice, for one officer for backup. I was nearby, so responded to his call letting him know that I was on his way. When I got there, he had his head between his knees and was silently crying. with a shattered chandelier a few feet from him. Now, before I had experienced the abnormal happenings in this building, I would have written off his testimony as idiocy. But he claimed that something held him in that spot as the chandelier started swinging violently until it began to fall. When it started to fall, he was let go and allowed to move, and scrambled out of the way before it crushed him. I got him up, calmed him down, and took him back to the supervisor. She yelled to one of our other supervisors, "Oi, Darren, I almost lost another one in that building." The other supervisor laughed and said, "Why do you think we always send the new guys? You know I don't even like going there." That guy is my roommate, and he hates it when I bring up that experience. When living in a major metropolitan city, you never know what walks of life you will pass or drop off. So, a little backstory. In 2003, I was a 16-year-old employee at an urban clothing store here on the south side of Chicago. At the time, I had a manager who was in his early 20s by the name of Anthony. Anthony was pretty arrogant and obnoxious, but overall he was a pretty cool guy. I used to kind of give him crap and tease him when it came to approaching the ladies, because he always seemed too timid or too aggressive. I was and still am a ladies' man, so yeah, I was being an arse. After working at this place for about 3 months, Anthony asks me if I drop him off at his home. It wasn't far from the direction I was heading in, so I dropped him off maybe twice a week for the next month. Now let me tell you, these car rides were uncomfortable. This guy, as much as we spoke at work, would not speak and sort of just kept looking straight. It got to the point that his awkwardness went from entertaining, as I was 16. Most awkward people are interesting to teenagers, to straight creepy. Fast forward 3 years later. I'm watching the news as they go into horrific details of a crime committed by a Comcast installation worker. Apparently, the Comcast worker entered 2 homes he was due for an installation, raped, beat, and strangled 2 women. The real unfortunate thing is this happened on 2 different occasions, and after the first murder the gentleman was arrested and questioned, but released and was sent back to work, which allowed him to strike again. As the picture of his mugshot flashed on the screen, I froze. It was Anthony. Now, growing up on the south side of Chicago, I have grown up and befriended a fair share of people who grew up to be murderers, but this took the cake. So Anthony Triplet, let's not meet, because that would only mean I'd be in jail with you. Okay, so I'm not conventionally pretty nor classically pretty. I'm the Duffy in any friend group I'm in. I never worried about being hit on, disrespected or kidnapped. I've never had to worry about my own safety when I go out, as I was never the one anyone wanted to get to know or be around because I am so plain, and it's always me that has to be the lookout for my friends, male and female alike. Now, I like to go to a local bar almost daily. I don't drink alcohol there, just a normal Coke, and wait for my ride home. It's my usual hangout spot after work, so I just sit and chill and mind my own business. A few weeks ago, I'd gotten off work and was just chilling at my usual spot, and sipping on my drink while working on a new pendant I was making. I started wire wrapping crystals into jewellery. I didn't think anyone would try and talk to me since I basically blended into the walls, even though the staff knew me and paid slight attention to me and are nice to me, but this weird guy I'd never seen before came over and sat at my table across from me. I was surprised and looked up at him, and struck up a small conversation that I can't remember how it started, but he began talking to me and asked a few questions about myself, and I thought they were normal and they all flowed together, so didn't think much of them. Again, I'm plain. I didn't think anyone would want to do anything to me. I had just drank 3 glasses of soda by then, and had to use the restroom, so grabbed my phone and purse and went to the bathroom. I may not have been worried about being abducted, but I did worry about my identity cache and contacts. And I was back a few minutes later and resumed my work. Since none of my stuff had been touched, I called over a waitress and asked her for a new drink, and she nodded, as it had always been ingrained to me that you never leave your drink unattended, and if you do, have it remade or just leave it to the bartender. As she was going to grab my old drink, which I only taken a few sips out of, the guy got a bit huffy at me, saying I was being wasteful just ordering a new drink. I looked at him with a raised eyebrow in confusion. I asked why it was his business if I did. It was my money after all, and the refills were free. He then said I was making more work for the waitress for no reason. This annoyed me, and I again told him that it was my business, and that if he didn't like it, he can always leave. He then tried to wave the waitress off with letting her change my drink, but I'd had enough of his nonsense and told him flat out, "Then you drink it, if you think it's such a waste." It seemed to have caught him off guard, and he looked at me, shocked, and then was a bit angry before leaving. I then looked at the drink and handed it to the waitress and told her that something didn't feel right about the guy, and I asked if the bartender could keep an eye on him, and they'd dump out my drink and just bring me water from then on. I left for home after being picked up shortly after, and found out the next day after work that he had been arrested for assault. I didn't find out till today what exactly happened. Apparently he had gotten into a fight with the bartender working that night. The bartender caught him putting something into a girl's drink when she wasn't looking, and stopped her from drinking it. The guy got so mad it started a whole fight. The cops were called and now he's awaiting trial. Apparently, as he's trying to see if he can get someone like me who's always had a guard down for herself because my confidence was low, he thought I'd be an easy mark with just a little attention. But when I didn't just drink my drink, when I came back he had to try another girl. If he really was targeting me, I have to question his sanity and sobriety. Thank goodness those old lessons about safety growing up. Thank you, Mum and Dad. And to the guy at the bar, let's never meet again.
Let me preface this story by saying why I was traveling alone. One of my best friends, Kayla, and I worked seasonally at a hiking lodge in British Columbia for the summer. We are both girls in our early 20s. She lives and goes to school in New Brunswick, and I live and work as a chef in Toronto for the winter. We decided this year, as I bought a car, instead of flying back home, we would do an epic Canadian coast-to-coast road trip. Everything was going wonderfully. So wonderfully, in fact, we ended up staying longer in a few unexpected places and had to cut our East Coast portion of the trip short. Now, my friend Kayla started her schooling on November 1st, so I dropped her home in Moncton, New Brunswick on Halloween, and stayed the night at her place, planning to head back to Toronto the next day. After a few glasses of Chardonnay and some laughs, I decided I couldn't come this close to the East Coast and not see the Cabot Trail in Nova Scotia, something that has been on my bucket list for years. So knowing I still had a week or more's vacation before my winter contract, I hastily booked a hostel for the next day, at Acolyte Hostel on the Cabot Trail. When I booked, only one option came up, I assume because I waited until the last minute to book. A private dorm with a queen-size bed for $35. Instantly, I thought it was a bargain, and booked straight away. I left Kayla's house in Moncton at 7 a.m., knowing I had a long drive ahead of me. The Cabot Trail is roughly 150 kilometers long, so I thought, to be safe, I'd plug the hostel address into my Google Maps and head straight there to get my bearings. I would arrive at the hostel for roughly noon, knowing it was too early to check in. I figured I'd consult with the front desk to figure out if they had any nearby hiking trails, and take my bags in later. I was about to arrive to my hostel according to Google, but all around me was nothing but farmland. Google then instructed me that my destination was on my left. I saw nothing. About 50 yards up the road, I saw a wire bar bent to look like a letter A, spray-painted bright red. I was staying at the Acolyte Hostel, so I guess that must be the place. I followed the dirt road. It led me to what I can only describe as a dilapidated barn, no signage, and there were two cars parked in front. so I parked alongside and got out of my car as I tried to figure out where I was. Once I exit my vehicle, a smallish man in his mid-40s with dark hair and intense eyes popped out of the barn and asked me if I was staying with them tonight. I said that I was, and he asked why I booked so last minute, and I explained my situation and he seemed satisfied with my answer. He insisted on taking me on the grand tour of the barn. The first thing I noticed was the entirety of the barn had been dug out of its foundation about 5 feet deep and 3 feet around. He led me across some particle board laid down as a sort of ramp leading inside. The second thing I noticed about the property was that there were no windows. It was clearly a barn meant for livestock. The gentleman leading me on this tour was named Kevin, the owner. He proceeded to tell me about his grand plans for the space. It all seemed pretty far-fetched, as it was a big old barn with particle boards separating most of the rooms. He led me up the skeleton stairs made of plywood and 2x4s to the cabin loft, where I would be sleeping that night, along with his family, the mother of his 5-year-old son, his son and Kevin's own mother, who insisted I call her Mum. The upstairs was certainly open concept. A frail curtain separated the beds to the sides with a large open area in the middle. I asked if I was the only occupant that night, and he said yes. I had a feeling he didn't often get occupants. I told him I was interested in the hikes in the area and wanted to get to them before it got dark. He gave me very detailed instructions of his favorite hikes and how to get to them, and off I went. I figured the place wasn't ideal, and I wish the website would have let me know it was still being built. But hey, I booked last minute and beggars can't be choosers. Plus, he was very friendly and helpful on my hiking advice. I hiked the area until it started getting dark. I didn't pack enough food for the day, but I figured I'd head into town for dinner. The nearest town was clearly a banging tourist destination during the summer, but now was the off-season, and it was a ghost town. All the hotels and B&Bs in the area were boarded up, such a ghost town that even the liquor store was closed for the off-season. Finally, I found a dark, dingy, empty bar to eat dinner. It was, to phrase it lightly, a disappointing supper. I had this romantic image in my head of me sitting on the harbour front sipping on bubbly, slurping back some fresh ocean oysters. I was assured by the server/bartender/cook that the oysters I had ordered were definitely not fresh, and I decided to not ask further. I figure, with all my options for things to see and do exhausted, I should just head back to the hostel and read my book. I got back for roughly 8 p.m, and I could smell the family that lived there were in the midst of cooking dinner. A little boy ran down the stairs and greeted me. He yelled, as little boys always do, "My name's JP, what's yours?" "Nice to meet you, JP. I'm Alex." He immediately asked if I wanted to come and play. I said definitely, and asked to just give him a moment to put my bags down. He followed me through the translucent curtains to my room, so instead of getting settled in, I headed straight out into the main area and started throwing a foam ball around with JP. His mother and father, Kevin, and grandmother, Mum, were all sitting down there to eat without even acknowledging we were playing in front of them. The mother and father start what seemed to be a basic argument, which turns into them yelling at each other. Completely weirded out, I told JP I needed to return to my room to call my mummy as she was wondering where I was. Of course, the boy who doesn't understand proper boundaries yet follows me through the curtains and sits on my bed. I tried taking his attention away from his family fight, so I asked him where he was going to school and his favorite colors and stuff. His mother starts calling for him, and he doesn't answer. Instead, he chooses to sit on my lap and hug me. Not wanting to cause any problems, I yell to the mother that he's in my room. She runs and snatches him off my lap, and yells to the father, "I know what you're like when you get angry. I'm taking JP. Don't follow us." I hear her booking it down the stairs and him running after her. I hear a car start up in the lot, and not just drive but peel out of the driveway. I hear him cursing, slamming doors, and the sound of the excavator which I had seen outside earlier that day come on. I guess he wanted to do some handiwork to let off some steam. Now, just left upstairs is me and Grandma, who insisted I still call her Mum. I walked out of my not-so-private curtained room with my bag and say, "Listen, you guys are great hosts, but I should be going." She starts rubbing my arm and telling me to stay, explaining her daughter-in-law doesn't understand Kevin like she does, and that she is the real problem. Now I'm fully ready to tell Mum to just piss off right then and there, until I realize she still has a knife in her hand from cooking dinner. It's only a 4-inch paring knife, but with intent. I'm sure it would do some damage. I don't think she meant it as a threat. I think she was just a kooky old bird who didn't understand. Maybe don't hold the knife while trying to console a stranger. So I go along with what she's saying until she rubs my arm with one hand and flays the knife around with the other. I inch closer and closer downstairs towards the door. She keeps rubbing my arm and shoulder with her free hand, telling me to stay and that her grandson is special. And before I even booked the night, he had a premonition that I would be staying with them. As soon as I get out the door, I run towards my car. I start my engine and back up the lot to get out of there. Kevin in the excavator blocks the path, with about a 5-foot ditch on one side of the drive and the forest behind me. He gets out, says he's sorry, and tells me I should stay and that he'll make it up to me. Grandma comes out, knife still in hand, saying it's Kevin's fault I'm leaving. They bicker for 5 minutes until I yell if they don't let me leave, I'd call the police. All of a sudden they get super defensive, like I'm the one being unreasonable, so I turn off my engine and start to dial. Kevin gets back in his excavator and starts backing up. As soon as he's far enough away, I can see the opening to drive across the grass. I turn my engine back on and rip out of the drive. I'm sure I'm doing a number on the suspension of my little sedan. As soon as the property is out of sight, I go to call my friend Kayla. No service. I remember back to earlier in the afternoon when I first got to the hostel. I was going to check my messages and saw the no service sign. Even if I'd have wanted to call the cops, I wouldn't have been able to. I drove the 6 hours straight to Moncton, New Brunswick, and stayed with Kayla again. The site I used to book was Hostel World. Once I got back to Toronto, I couldn't even find them online anymore. I did, however, receive an email from Kevin explaining he was sorry and not to leave a negative review. They're not on any sites, Yelp, TripAdvisor, etc., so I couldn't even leave them a review if I wanted to. Funnily enough, they're still on Booking.com and have really good reviews. I think it might be cool when there are other people there too. In any case, I would never return and not recommend it to anyone, and I'm fairly certain I dodged several bullets that night.
I worked at a hospital, doing transport for a few years. The transport home base was in the basement of the hospital, where all the laundry is done and supplies are also sorted there. I hated working late nights after this incident. On this particular night, I was the only one in the basement when I heard whistling at the end of the hallway by the elevator. I poked my head around the corner, expecting to see my only co-worker on duty that night, but there was absolutely no one there. I shrugged it off. I'm not easily spooked. Nights are slow, so I ate some snacks and hung out in the break room for a bit. Next thing I know, I hear a loud bang. I walked into the hallway, and a bed is rolling down the hall, bumping into the sides. At this point, I just think my co-worker's messing with me. I radio him and he says he's upstairs in the cafeteria. I still don't believe him, and I'll catch him in the act. I walk past the laundry room, and the machines start. I pop my head in and expect him to find him there, but it's completely empty. Okay, starting to get a little nervous. I walk into the laundry room, and the machines completely stop. I freeze, then run out and head towards the elevator when I hear whistling again. At this point I know I'm the only worker in the basement. As I'm standing there waiting for the elevator, things start falling off the shelves down the hall. Boxes of gloves, tissues, packets of tubes. I'm literally standing there watching them fall off one by one at the opposite end of the hallway, and I kid you not, my entire body broke out in goosebumps. My hair stood on end, and I had this strong gut feeling of being watched. I was not alone. As I'm getting onto the elevator, I feel what felt like someone brushing my arm. I went upstairs and found my co-worker in the cafeteria, freaked out to him and got the hell out of there, and transferred soon after. The creepy thing to add is that while I usually whistle mindlessly to myself while working, it was almost like the spirit was mocking me. Creepiest feeling ever. My husband and I moved into this house in December of 2018. Ever since getting pregnant in July of 2019, I've been noticing some weird stuff. Allow me to elaborate. I hear noises constantly, or things would just fall for no reason, even if the fridge door is closed. There was this one time at 3 a.m. I had just heard something metal fall in the living room. We have cameras in some of the rooms of the house, and my camera has night vision and texts me when the baby's crying. Sometimes I'll be outside with the baby, or not at home at all, and I'll get a text saying, "Baby crying in nursery." The night vision will blink on and off, as if the lights are flickering in broad daylight. The camera turns on its own sometimes, and our cat even disappeared in early March, and since then, my husband and I keep hearing a cat meow in various parts of the house. We've searched so profoundly, and even started pulling apart the attic on the off chance he got stuck in something, to no avail. Not to mention that my son's room stays cold 24/7. Our summers get as hot as 100 degrees, so we usually keep the AC at 74. Well, my son had this habit of kicking the blanket off at night, and then waking up and crying when he got cold, so I started turning the AC off before bedtime. His room felt like 50 degrees regardless. My son, at only 1, does this weird thing where he just stops and stares at nothing, blank wall, ceiling, whatever, and then reaches out to grab the air. It happens multiple times a day, and yet only in the house. The dogs are scared to come in. I literally have to drag them in when it's too hot or too cold. They'll even curl up in a ball by the door and wait to go out shaking. Before my cat disappeared, he wouldn't really leave my son's side. He slept literally in his crib or on the edge of the rail of the crib in the dresser next to the crib. But if I would try to take the cat out of the room at night, he would attack me and return to his spot. This being the most docile cat in the world, which is why it attacking me was super strange. Recently, I woke up to the sound of my bedroom door slamming shut. I usually keep it open so that I can hear my son if he wakes up. My husband works overnight, so it wasn't him. About 10 minutes later, I hear the most gut-wrenching cry and scream. I run in and pick up my son, who's shaking violently and crying. After he calmed down and fell back asleep in my lap, I looked at the camera in his room to see what had happened. He had woken up and stood up immediately, stared across the room, reached for the air, and then his whole body started trembling so hard I could see it on camera that he just starts screaming. He had nightmares before, but he usually wakes up and just lays there and cries until I pick him up. Soft cries. Nothing as scary as the ones I experienced that night. And there was once when my baby was asleep in the house in his room, and I was outside with in-laws around 11 p.m, and we all heard a baby crying loudly in the house, so we ran inside to check, but he was fast asleep. But everyone heard this, not just me. When I bring it up to my husband, he gets annoyed with me for believing in ghosts and tells me to stop, but I'm literally scared to fall asleep because the noises have started again. So tonight I had a very serious talk with my husband about everything and seriously wanting to move. The main reason being the ghost, but there are other reasons too. When I first met him, he was my supervisor. We had both transferred to the same location in the same month. We were both new, so kind of stuck together and instantly became close friends. I knew he had a girlfriend of 6 years that he had just moved there with, and I had no intentions of interfering. We were genuinely just like work friends. One day he came up to me and told me that he was done with her. He broke up with her and she was moving out. That he realized he didn't want to go home for her for the past year because he wasn't happy, but didn't realize that he was so unhappy until seeing how happy he was around me. So she moved out, and a few months later, we started dating, and bam, accidentally pregnant. But apparently when her mum came down to help her move her stuff out of the house, she had a crystal ball with her that she kept rubbing and whispering something to. She's really into brujeria. It's witchcraft in English, I think. And my husband said that's the reason it's been so cold, because he knows it's not a ghost, but pretty sure her mum to this day is holding a grudge and cursing me in some way, or the house. He just tries not to think about it, because he feels like if he feels his anger and fears it, it'll feed into it. That's why it's mostly my son that is physically affected, because apparently his ex wanted to have kids. My husband did not want to have kids with her, as she's very manipulative, and when she found out I was pregnant, she lost her mind. Apparently, he was also worried about making me more scared or worried because he didn't want to tell me, as I have borderline disorder and I tend to overreact. But that's why he wanted to present our baby to the church despite not being religious, just in case. His dad will be by this week to bless the house. So it turns out my father-in-law was going to come and bless the house on Sunday after his church sermon, as he's a pastor. But the Friday before, he suffered a stroke. He was eating and couldn't move one side of his body. My son wakes up with nightmares still, or talks to the wall or reaches out, like someone is there. I still hear baby cries in the house, even when the babies are asleep, or not even home. My dogs are still terrified to enter my house. And about 2 weeks ago, our house almost caught fire. We have a small laundry room that's only big enough for the washer and dryer, and some rooms for the doors to open and close. On the top shelf above the washer is our laundry soap. One day when my kids were at Grandma's house, I was on the way to pick them up, and my husband was sleeping. He said he heard a loud thud and got up to see what it was. The washer and dryer were never on, and the soap was pushed towards the wall on the back of the shelf. But when he got up, the soap had fallen off the shelf and busted open on the washer and floor, and hit the plugs behind it, and everything started catching fire. My husband was thankfully there and was able to put it out, and immediately shut the breaker off. When I got home, the brake had been turned back on, and he swears he didn't do it, but the soap had dried, so nothing caught fire again. This incident happened in the summer of 2015. I lived by myself in a nice house in a small town. Low crime, but still the occasional shady person. Anyway, at work one day on a smoke break, I watched a dog get thrown from a moving vehicle. 4-lane city traffic during the start of rush hour. I ran out of there, scooped him up and booked it back to my workplace. He was miraculously not injured. As a bleeding heart animal lover, I decided to take him home with me, until I could figure out what to do with him. I have a large amount of cats, and always have done. This was my first experience with a dog that I was solely responsible for. This guy was very shy, head hung, tail tucked, jumpy, just looking at me like I was about to beat him. I was clueless on the subject of dog personalities and tendencies. I just knew that they needed to be taken out frequently. His first night with me, we had been out about 15 times, as I did not want him pooing in my house. I was having my final cigarette of the day on my porch around 10:30. The dog was on a lead, chilling under my chair as I smoked and poked about on Reddit, when I see a man walking on the sidewalk that runs by my house. He keeps glancing up at me before passing. Shortly after he passes my house, he stopped, turned on his heels and approached. "Hey, can you tell me where 302 Church Street is?" I'd told him I'd searched the address on my phone, which of course was taking a minute to pop up. He explained he didn't have a phone of his own and was attempting to get to a friend's house, taking small steps towards me the whole time. Finally, the address I summoned came up. "It's exactly 2 blocks north of here, right on the southwest corner and across the street," I told him, pointing in the direction. He kept his eyes locked on me, continuing to slowly move closer. That's when the dog starts growling very softly at that point. I'd almost forgotten he was there. "Mind if I look at that map?" He grinned sheepishly. "Bad with directions, you know." I rose from my seat, pointing again. "It's truly just 2 blocks up the road. Just follow it. 2 blocks. The house will be on your left," making it very clear I wasn't going to hand him my phone. "Well, can I call him? Need to let him know I'm coming, ain't I?" he said, creeping closer still, extending his hand. "No." "How about text him?" "Dude, no." Start making my way towards my door. Just let me see your phone." He was visibly becoming pissed off, clearly trying to contain it and getting way too close to my porch. As a last-ditch effort of getting this dude to leave, I say, "You need to get off my yard. My dog is protective, and he'll mess you up." Hell, I didn't know anything about this dog, let alone whether he had the capability to mess someone up. I just hoped saying it would intimidate the guy. Like I had said the magic word, the pup sprang into action. Like a la the wolf creature, from the never-ending story he emerges like a bullet from under the chair, growling, snarling, and barking his little butt off. He jerks me, damn near off the porch, trying to get this guy. He sounded and acted like an 80-pound dog, not a 40-pound timid beagle mix. I was afraid. I didn't know if the pup would turn on me. As stated previously at the time, I knew absolutely nothing about dogs. He backed his hindquarters into my legs, almost nudging me to the door, still carrying on, eyes locked on the dude and baring his teeth. The dude held up his hands and backed off, stammered something like, 2 blocks north, yeah?" and began walking that way. I go in, cut my lights off and peek out the window. He glances at the house. Assured I'm inside, he turns and begins to walk in a completely opposite direction. Icing on the cake, he pulls out a phone from his pocket, raises it to his ear, and makes a call. The dog secured his place as a member of my family that night. He is incredibly protective of me, and has frightened away another creeper since this incident. He is attached to my hip, and has made it known that he is grateful to be in a safe and loving home, wherein he will never be again a projectile from a moving vehicle. His name is Hank, and I truly believe that night would have ended very poorly for me had he not been there. I was in the orthopedic surgery wing of the hospital after getting my torn Achilles tendon repaired. It was a fairly long procedure, and I was pretty groggy from the anesthesia after effects combined with the morphine for the pain. But I did notice that I had a roommate that had both of his hands and feet wrapped in bandages. I could hear him talking to his father, but didn't pay much attention because of how out of it I was at the time. I did remember hearing something about, "Why did you stop taking your medication?" I don't know how morphine affects anyone else, but it gives me a very restless sleep combined with vivid dreams, almost nightmares, something I've never had. So in the middle of the night, while turning over for the 1000th time, I spied someone standing beside my bed in the dark. "Got any smokes?" My roommate apparently was standing there watching me sleep, waiting for me to wake up to ask for cigarettes. It could be considered very polite or very creepy, but when you are in a morphine-induced haze, it was definitely creepy. Later that day, I heard the details of why he was there. He had gone off his meds and decided to quit smoking hardcore. I mean liquid nitrogen cold turkey. First, he nailed his feet to the floor so he couldn't go out for smokes. Then, he took a butcher's knife from the kitchen and cut off the fingers of his left hand so that he couldn't hold the cigarette. That's where his plan kind of fell apart, because he had a lot of trouble cutting off the right fingers with no left fingers to hold the knife. He only got through 3 of them. I put this together between the conversations I overheard between family, nurses, and doctors. I was supposed to be in there for another day, but they told me I could go home early if I was okay with taking Tylenol 3 for the pain. I would have to stay if I needed the stronger morphine painkiller, so the staff could administer it. I said I would go home with aspirin if it meant getting out of that room. The head nurse at the nursing station was sympathetic and said the guy really needed to be put in a different kind of hospital. But he had orthopedic issues that had to be dealt with, and that's why he was there. It wasn't supernatural, just a mentally disturbed individual who had hurt himself. He probably couldn't even have hurt anyone else considering his injuries. But in my morphine fog, it was creepy as hell to have someone that disturbed 10 feet away while I was sleeping. When we are young, preteen and teenage girls, we believe that a prince will come and sweep us off our feet. It's not until we're a bit older that we realize how many creeps use that against us. I had just turned 14 when we finally moved from Texas to Indiana. We moved into this big 3-bedroom house with 3 trailers behind it. In one of those trailers was a guy that would often talk to me. I thought it was cool to have an older man like me. He asked me to be his girlfriend and I accepted. My dad noticed him giving me attention and grounded me from going outside. He got a letter to me, asking me to meet him at the parking lot at midnight. My dumb butt did. When I got there, he had some popcorn and soda for me. My next memory is laying on the merry-go-round with him and another man standing over me. I tried to get up but blacked out again. My next memory is the back of his car driving violently through a cornfield, and my next memory is waking up in my bed with no memory of how I got there. I got up while my dad was at work and went to ask him what happened, but he had packed up and left. Years later, as I was driving down a road that was near the old house, when I was passing a cornfield, all of a sudden a memory of that night popped into my head. I remember walking up in that cornfield all alone at midnight. I somehow made it home and got back to bed. I don't know why I couldn't remember this before. Those guys thought I had died and panicked. They drove me to the cornfield and put me out there. It took me years before I realized how close I came to death. So if you lived in a trailer behind a house in Whiteland, Indiana in 1989, I hope you've never hurt any other kids.
I work the 3 to 11 shift at a seasonally driven hotel. In the off-season, October to May, we go from 2 people at the front desk each shift to 1 person. I'm the supervisor, so I get stuck alone a lot. Last February-ish on a Monday around 10 p.m, the phone rings. I answer it with my usual hotel spiel. "Thank you for calling this hotel. How may I help you?" On the other end of the line was an Asian guy whose English was awful. He paused for a second before asking me something in Chinese. "I'm sorry, sir, I only speak English. I can transfer you to the reservations. They have a translator." Click. The dude hangs up on me. Okay, fine. Now my shift ends in an hour. I have a system down where I do all my closing reports, count my bank, all this stuff, get ready to leave. In the middle of counting my bank, the phone rings again. "Thank you for calling. How may I help you?" It was the same guy. At this point I was a tad annoyed, and I haven't transferred straight to reservation so they can find someone who understands what he needs. Not 5 seconds after I transfer him back, the phone rings again. It's the damn guy again, and in very broken English he asks to speak to Cho. I don't have a Cho who works here. I ask if they're a guest. The guy's talking very fast to someone in the background when a younger guy gets on the phone. "I'm very sorry to bother you, but my father is confused. Who am I speaking to?" I'm getting more annoyed by the second. Is it time for me to go yet? "Hi, this is the hotel. Who are you trying to reach today?" The son doesn't say anything for a second. Then I hear him speaking to his dad in the background. After a few seconds of loud arguing, the son comes back, apologizes for bothering me, and hangs up. Then the phone rings again. It's the son. "Look, ma'am, I'm really sorry, but I'm not trying to call you. We've been trying to call my dad's best friend Cho all night. He had the same phone number for years, and we've never had a problem. It's only the past few times it reroutes to you." I tell him that my phone number is this, and he tells me the number he's trying to dial. I recognize it as the cell phone from my state, but it shouldn't reroute to my hotel. I get the son's number, tell him to try dialing Cho's number, and I'll let him know. Dial Mr. Cho, and instead of going to voicemail, it takes me to my hotel's extension options, where if you hit 0, you'll ring front desk. Okay, this is getting weird. I call the kid back and tell him my finding. The family is in panic when the son tells me the reason why they need to get a hold of this Cho. "Look, ma'am, I don't mean to freak you out, but Cho was fired from his job yesterday, and he's been acting very strange ever since. This morning he texted my dad basically a suicide note thanking him for being such a good friend, asking him to look out for his wife and daughter, and that he hopes they meet again someday. And Cho hasn't answered any calls since. We talked to the daughter a few hours ago, and she says he hasn't been home all day, and their handgun and rifle are both missing. Is there any way you can look up to see if he's staying there with you or something?" At this point I'm freaking out. It's quite dead in the hotel. I have maybe 10 rooms in the house. It's just me and the Mexican housekeeper there, and I know for a fact I haven't had any Asian gentlemen check in with us in over a week. I checked in everyone who came in that day, and I know for a fact there was no Mr. Cho at my hotel. I apologize profusely and explain that he's not here, and the best thing to do would be to contact his local police and report a missing person, and perhaps call my town police as well and report it to them too. I say that if I find anything out, I'll call them back. They thank me and we disconnect. It's 10:45 and it's creepy at the hotel. Is it possible someone checked in for him? Are the housekeepers going to walk in to find a dead guy in the morning? The overnight guy comes in and I don't tell him anything. He's already paranoid and weird to begin with. Telling him would make things worse. And I go home and dream a lot about suicidal people. Fast forward 3 days and the body of an unidentified man is found in the bay about 2 blocks from my hotel. He had a gunshot wound in his head. Later that day, he is identified by a family friend as Mr. Cho. It's definitely the scariest thing that's ever happened to me.
I work the evening shift at a hospital that is believed to be, at least by 90% of the staff, haunted. I'm part of the 90%. You see, there have been horror stories about every building, floor, and pretty much every part of the campus. I mostly wander around alone as a housekeeper, and that makes it much worse. At least when my mind is on it. Usually I try not to think about it. My personal experience was back in the ultrasound wing of the radiology clinic. By the time I get around to that area, the lights automatically dim, and there isn't anything I can do about it. It's always spooky back there at night, so I usually just get done with what I need to do and move on. The place is kind of shaped like a J, like a long hallway that curves around. On the inner side of the curve, there's a dressing room that opens up to a mammography suite, and then opens again at the top of the J. If you're standing at the bottom of the J, you can see through the doors of both rooms to the top of the J. I was standing back there, trying to bag on my card, when something moved in the corner of my eye. I looked up, and through the dressing and mamma rooms, to the other doorway opposite me. I vividly remember it like it was yesterday. A male figure walks past the door right before my eyes. I literally watched it amble slowly across my field of vision. There are no male ultrasound techs here, and it was not my boss. It looked like it was wearing dark clothing, had long hair, but was definitely male. I snapped out of it and ran over to see if some freak had wandered in, but there wasn't anyone. I grabbed my stuff and ran out without finishing all the work, 'cause screw that. Another story, which isn't my personal experience, comes from the second floor of the hospital. The second floor has nothing but offices and computer labs, all adjacent to one corridor that spans the entire length of the building. On one end is a set of elevators, and on the other, a pair of double doors that opens into a computer lab. This floor is infamous for being the domain of something the workers affectionately call Matilda. The first story I heard about her was from a co-worker who knew someone who worked on that floor. He came in for whatever reason doing office stuff and was going home late one night. He walks out of the office and starts towards the elevators when something catches his eye, so he turned towards the computer lab. At the end of the hallway, there was what looked like a patient peeking into the lab. He walks towards her and asks her who she is and what floor she came from. She turns around, and she has no face. The office guy is frozen in place, scared out of his mind. He wants to run away, but he doesn't want to turn his attention away from whoever or whatever is staring him down at the other end of the hall. What does he do instead? He closes his eyes as tight as he can, and after several seconds or minutes or however long it was, he opens them, and she's gone. He says he's never ran as fast in his life as he did that night, straight outside without ever looking back. Another Matilda happening was when one of the managers left a tape recorder going in his office, also on the second floor, because he wanted to see if he could catch any weird noises or voices. The next day I'm walking by his office with a co-worker, and he calls us in there and plays the recording to see if we hear it. After forever with nothing, a faint voice comes in and says, "Turn it off." That was spooky as hell. I've got another story. I'm in the MRI suite right now where my friend, Sandra, told me she had a scary experience. Like the ultrasound area, MRI can sometimes give off a creepy vibe. I've never seen anything back here personally, but Sandra has. She told me about a time where she had come in late one night to prep the MRI. The suite is shaped like a W, with the middle wedge representing the computer workstation, and the outer ones being the MRI rooms themselves. On opposite sides of the workstation, there are windows looking into the rooms, and you can see the reflection of the window behind you in the one in front of you. She was back here alone that night, prepping the machine and half asleep. It began to dawn on her that something felt wrong, and she began to experience a feeling of dread. Whatever it was made her feel so uncomfortable and restless that she snapped out of it and woke up. She looks up into the window, into the suite, and sees a silhouette of a figure standing in the corner. She doesn't know what the hell it is. Thinking, she sees things, but remembers how I said you can see the reflection of one window in that other. She realizes that the figure isn't standing in the corner of that room, but is rather standing in front of the other window behind her, just staring at her. We live in a newer home that we had built. We moved in 2018. Ever since we moved in, I would hear things like footsteps or scratching. I would see what appeared to be shadows. It got to be as much as a forceful tap on my shoulder. This has gone on since we moved in. I'm home most of the time by myself. My wife and daughter are gone during school hours while I work from home. I have 2 dogs that mostly sleep all day in the dog bed behind me. This means I should not hear anything occurring outside of the immediate room I'm in. Recently, my daughter has said that she no longer feels safe in her room at night, also in the basement. She's 9. We explained to her that there's nothing to be afraid of, and that she has both dogs to keep her company at night. She replies that the dogs no longer feel safe either. That's a hard one to understand. So in the last 2 weeks or so, we moved her furniture upstairs. My office remains down there, however. Since moving her room to the main floor, she claims to feel at ease, and that she can sleep at night. One big thing, however. Now, I feel somewhat terrified to work downstairs during the day. It's hard to explain. I feel like all day I'm being watched. I feel brushes of cold air when the fan and air conditioner are off. One of the dogs, Luna, came down the hall the other day and froze halfway. She got really low to the ground and basically crawled into the office. She had this terrified look about her. She looked like someone was yelling at her or about to hit her. For the record, we do not hit our dogs, but she just had that look, like she was getting swatted. When she got to me, she was shaking, so I called for Daisy to come into the room, our other dog. She came down the hall and started to growl as she walked past the part where Luna had just been. She quickly went around the corner, turned around with her back to me, and stared down the hall. She was as stiff as a board, and I didn't move for several minutes despite me calling her over and over again. I managed to capture a full minute of her stance, and it creeped me out. Clearly both dogs saw something that I could not. This has been playing into some of my fears and makes me wonder if my daughter not feeling safe anymore is related. More so in the last few weeks. I've also found lights on that should be off and others that are never on. And again, I'm the only one home. So either something is happening or my mind is playing tricks on me. There have also been a few neighbors that have complained of issues lately. Things being moved, TVs turning on when no one's home, pets being locked in rooms, or dogs and cats fixating on things that shouldn't be there. How can we find out the spiritual history of our land is something I'd like to know. A little while after, it turns out that our dogs had calmed down. That was until I woke up in the middle of the night from what I suspected was a dream. It felt like the dog was jumping off the bed, which normally I don't notice, but it jostled me enough to wake me up. I slept on my side, so I slowly opened my eyes, and, as they adjusted or whatnot, I believed I saw something or someone at the edge of my bed. At that height they would have been on their knees, and I just heard, "You can call me Gary." Such an uncommon name. I don't know any. I don't work with any. None of my clients are named Gary. That is a name that was not on my mind. In other news, not sure I mentioned this before, but one of the neighbors around the corner who have experienced a lot of activity in their daughter's nursery, their house caught fire a week or so ago. Their house is less than 2 years old. It caught fire and they lost everything. The fire marshal said it started in their basement. Otherwise, things remain normal-ish, and I'm in a meeting with a medium tomorrow. Her initial research has her thinking that we live on a burial site, which of course is fantastic. I like to do work around homes in my spare time. I found a guy in the gigs section who was doing some renovations on a duplex and was looking for an extra hand. He knew electrical. I was good with carpentry. Perfect. Pick up some extra cash and skills working a few nights. We send a few texts and he stops over to meet me. Nice enough guy, and we planned to get started. I would usually take the bus around the city, but my mum and sister were in town, so they gave me a lift. Don't end up locked in a basement, my sister jokes, as I hop out. He offers a beer while he breaks down the project, and from what I can tell, he's doing a nice job. We talk about the work in general for a bit, and kick back with another beer, maybe two. Time's passing, and he's supposed to be paying me for my time, so I find it a little odd. But heck, it's how I would work on my house too, so power to you. Beers are cold, keep 'em coming. After 4 or 5, we finally get moving and do a few odd jobs that take all of half hour, and he's debating how far he wants to take it tonight. We have a beer while we think about it. I'm thinking of calling it a night. Another beer and a cigarette? I'll show you the rest of what I've been working on, he says. Works for me, as I follow him up from the table. I've lost count of how many India Pale Ale beers I've put back at this point, but my vision says I'm in the 10 to 12 range. He holds open the door and tells me to head down in front of him into the basement. Not until this very moment have I thought twice about the course of the night, but that one word brought it all rushing back into perspective. I'm on high alert. But he hasn't done anything egregious, so I finish the cigarette and pray that I don't take a wrench to the head on my way back up. Safe back at the table. So, do you miss your girlfriend? Yeah, she's in Jersey, so it's tough seeing her. Do you miss her sexually? The heck, man. Bells are ringing. It's 1 a.m. He changes the subject, but the mood has shifted. Sensing this, he decides to go for broke. What follows is a stream of things that shall not be repeated, beginning with an innuendo and easing not so gracefully into the explicit. I am legitimately afraid now when my brain is firing. 1, don't freak him out. At least I'm bigger. 2, who the hell does this? 3, do I really have nice legs? 4, I hope that there wasn't anything in those drinks. 5, if he pays me now, is this considered prostitution? You got the wrong sort of Craigslist section, buddy, is what I came out with in the end. He actually paid me, and I ran the 4 miles home, stopping only for Chinese food for some reason. I was drunk, had money to burn, and figured this decision couldn't be much worse than the last. For the last 10 years, I've been employed by the Department of Corrections as a correctional officer, sergeant, and then lieutenant. Over those years, I've encountered quite a few things, ranging from relatively mundane to downright unsettling. So here it goes. The facility I work at used to be an old medical hospital for the state some years ago, but was repurposed to be a work camp and then eventually a correctional facility. For context, this place used to not have a fence when it first started. According to some of the older officers I worked with, I never bothered to look into the place's background until some of the stranger things began to occur. Trust me, I know it sounds cliché, but the more I researched, the more I discovered that a fair amount of old hospitals were repurposed into prisons. My first encounter with strange happenings came some years ago, when I was still a fresh-faced officer. The facility has 2 different parts. One side has a higher-level security setup, while the main side houses our lower-level offenders. At the time, I worked at the higher-level side, with the 2-level offenders. For the most part, they behaved pretty well, except for a few times here and there, but that isn't important. What is important is that their cells had thick metal doors that locked whenever they closed. These doors could be opened via a mechanism that would unlock the doors all at once or individually with a normal lock. I was walking the halls, checking in through windows, making sure doors were secured, pretty much anything to get me through the night. For those that work nights, I'm sure I don't have to explain that some nights can be dreadfully boring. While performing my rounds, I turned the corner to head back to my office when I heard the loudest slam from where I had just come from. I turned back around, and to my surprise, all of the doors had somehow unlocked themselves and were flung wide open. Needless to say, all of the offenders were freaked out once they realized what happened, as was I. After ushering them back inside their rooms and giving another check, I went back to my office, almost expecting it to happen again, and phoned my sergeant and asked them what the cause could have been, and he just laughed. Now a bit of background on this guy. He was a sergeant for apparently forever. According to some of the stories I've heard, one of the old grizzled types, just jaded enough to keep the job, but not enough to become fully disillusioned, if that makes sense. He was a good guy overall, had an older technique of dealing with some of the offenders, but I guess it came with the territory. I trusted him well enough. However, when he said, "Oh, that's just Ben acting up," I was skeptical. Who's Ben? One of our old TB patients. What? Yeah, the wing used to be part of the tuberculosis clinic back when the place was a hospital. So the ghost of some TB patient opened all the doors at once? Yeah. Ben, he's harmless, just annoying sometimes. Right. So needless to say, I asked around about the elusive Ben. And sure enough, some of the older officers corroborated the story. Sometimes he'd tap underneath the floors from the basement, open and shut windows, the whole 9 yards. Obviously, my instinct was to try and research the patients, but I guess due to the age, they didn't keep good records. Either that, or just simple ineptitude. With me being unable to research it, I chalked it up to superstition and moved on. Small things happened here and there as the months went on. I would do a round, come back to my office, and my cup would be in a different spot to where I left it. Or someone would knock on my office door. But when I went to open it, there wouldn't be anyone there. Now normally I'm a pretty skeptical person, and would chalk those occurrences up to the long shifts or other officers pulling a prank, even though my dorm had doors that lock, and I can definitely hear when those big damn things would close. But as more things happened, the less sure of myself I became. Eventually I got promoted to sergeant. With that came more pay and more responsibilities. One of those included doing regular basement checks. Now I dreaded this, not because of the creepy factor, I could handle that, but because those basements are just slightly taller than cellars in most places, due to the piping and electrical. Being a tall person, I hated doing basement checks, but since they were part of my responsibilities, I didn't complain too much. My knees, however, did. Surely enough, while doing one of these checks in the facility's medical building, I got another unsettling encounter. The basement of the medical building must have been an old morgue, since one of the rooms had that big metal wall with the slots for bodies, I'm guessing. In the darkness, I tend to glance through that room as quickly as possible, and unfortunately for me, I noticed that one of the doors to the slots was open. To be honest, I was more irritated than scared, because now I had to do more thorough searching of the basement, and I radioed the situation to my lieutenant and let them know that I was going to be doing a detailed search. After cautiously entering the room, I found the light switch and went to work. Naturally, I found nothing out of the ordinary. I closed the door to the slot, gave the place one last sweep and headed topside to ask the medical staff some questions. General stuff, did anyone go down there, etc. Naturally, no one had been down there in a bit, since most of the basements are used for storage, and as convenient as a morgue body wall is for storage, it wouldn't have been the best idea to use it. Still, I couldn't shake that creepy feeling of being watched, even before I found the slot open. The next big event came in the dead of night. One of the more boring shifts. Mind you, this was back on the higher level part of campus. Though by this point, we had lost most of our higher level offenders, so it was pretty quiet over there. After talking to the officer responsible for the dorm, I made my way outside and to the sally port, an entrance essentially, to pick up some items. I spoke to one of the officers there for a bit, then made my way back to the dorms to resume a bit of paperwork and time killing. On the dorms, there are 3 wings, so the building essentially looks like a T, only all legs are equally sized, and each wing has 2 floors. Ever since most of the offenders were released or moved on, 1 floor of the wing has been utilized only. I tell you all of this because when I glanced upstairs into one of the windows, I saw what appeared to be the silhouette of something vaguely human. It was unmoving, didn't shift or appear as I kept my eyes on it while I approached the door to the dorm. I radioed the officer and asked what his location was. "I'm in the day room, Sergeant." "Downstairs?" "Downstairs." Crap. Keep in mind the wing that I saw the silhouette in was also entirely inactive and being used for storing old bunks, mattresses and other items. Also, there are doors that lead to the 2nd floor of each wing, and only sergeants and above have access to the keys that unlocked them. This entire time, I still had eyes on the person, so I talked to the officer again. "Meet me at your hallway door, please." "On my way." Eventually he made his way to the door and we talked. I looked towards him to ask him if he saw what I saw, and of course as soon as I looked back the thing is gone. I felt like I was in a cliché horror movie at that point. I was expecting heavy breathing in my radio next or something like that. So once again, being that I saw something suspect, I had to be the dumbass to go check it out. I made my way upstairs, unlocked the door and checked the place out. Thankfully the lights are practically always on up there, so I didn't have to deal with darkness like in the basement. As soon as I entered upstairs, the hair on the back of my neck stood up like I was being watched. I got this horribly uncomfortable feeling of not being welcome, like I had just entered a bear's turf. The entire time I was checking the place out, I couldn't shake that feeling. Eventually I found the room where I saw the silhouette, and wouldn't you know it, there wasn't an item in the room. No coat rack with a big jacket to make it look like a person, no lamp with a hat on it, nothing. And after checking the doors and windows, I promptly got the hell out of there and met up with the officer again to let him know what I saw. He was understanding but seemed a bit skeptical since he was a newer guy. Can't say I blame him, to be honest. There are several other smaller things that have happened as well. I guess I've been here long enough to experience a vast variety of these things. More silhouettes in windows of abandoned buildings, old storage buildings that light up all at once at night, and then flicker on and off throughout the night. With that one, I told my lieutenant that my arse wasn't going to go in there alone, not at 1 a.m. Objects moving on their own, even in our security footage. Hell, I've even spoken to several offenders who told me they hear voices at night in their room, and others that refuse to sleep in certain rooms at night at all. If you work in a place where you have access to security cameras and a board, definitely check those things out. I've seen chairs scoot around on their own, the hair of offenders move on its own, balls rolling on their own, and a few other things. Of course, I can't show you the footage. Legally, I'm not allowed to take it out of the gate, and I'm not going to lose my job for something that might be easily explained. Besides, being a lieutenant now, I mostly get to experience stuff like that throughout the cameras, or the stories that the officers now tell me when I make my rounds. Now, as I've said before, I hate going into the basements of various buildings for security checks. 2 of our main buildings have basements that must have been used to house patients back when the place was a medical facility, because the place is set up much like the hallways on the 1st and 2nd floor. When you think of where I work, don't think of one big cell block. Think more of a college dorm-style housing, at least on the main campus. I've taken my fair share of peeks around the basement, especially in the rooms and little cubbies that the place has, and the creepiest things I've encountered are the following. There is an old wooden door on one part of the basement that has the phrase, "Run away," scrawled into the wood. Now obviously when I first saw it I was a little freaked out, but since the words were on my side of the door, I quickly figured that it must have been a previous officer or other staff member that did it. The maintenance staff run through the basement all the time. Hell, it could have even been one of the offenders since before the pandemic they used to work with the maintenance staff. Not really paranormal or anything, but a neat little thing I wanted to add. In several of the older rooms, I've seen actual chains and places in the stonework where manacles once resided. When I first heard about it from my sergeant at the time, I obviously brushed it off as some workplace nonsense that they tell you to freak you out. Gotta get through nights somehow, right? But sure enough, I saw it. The realization happened. Yeah, the place used to be a medical facility. God only knows what kind of crazy, inhumane stuff went down here. We also have a tunnel network, and I wish I was joking. It has a full-on tunnel network that connects most of the buildings. Now this is one of those where I don't want to do too much poking around with, mostly because I mean tunnels. Obviously I'm yet to explore them fully, but I found some of the dead ends. It's weird as hell to turn a corner, walk a little, and then have the tunnel stop all of a sudden. I'm guessing they had plans for expansion or something at one point, or maybe even old buildings that got destroyed over time. When I asked the veterans about the tunnels, I got this. So why does this place have an entire tunnel system? That's how they transported the bodies, so the other patients wouldn't see them. What, so all the buildings are connected? To the old morgue? Yeah. Foolishly, it was around this time I finally decided to do some deep digging of the place. Now, I previously said the place was a hospital, then a work camp, then a correctional facility. But unbeknownst to me, it started off as an asylum. Once I learned that, obviously that little spark of excitement and muted fear entered my head. Like I've mentioned previously, I'm a skeptic, always have been. But when you learn what the old buildings you walk through regularly were part of, and had a TB wing, well, the horror movie buff inside me was practically giddy. One of the strangest things I've had happen to me involves me doing what 90% of my time was spent doing at night, walking around old buildings and checking doors. I was assigned to the administration building that night, and after the place settled down, I decided to make my rounds of the place. Now the building has a few places: a library, visitation rooms, classrooms, you name it. The main attraction, however, was the administration hall proper. This is where the warden's office resides, among several other of our higher-ups. At night, this place is pretty dead since most of the admin folk work their 8 to 4 shift. I was checking every door to make sure they were locked, when I heard something further down the hall start to rattle. For a visual, the hall is designed like a blocky, chubby U-shape. The sound seemed like it was coming from the other leg of the U, whereas I was on the opposite leg. I turned the corner and made my way down after calling out to see if someone was there. To no response. That's when every door in the hallway started to shake all at once, as if a horde of zombies got their cue to burst out the hallway. I'm not ashamed to admit that I booked it the hell out of there and closed the door behind me. Having been an officer at the time, I let my sergeant know, and once again was met with, "Yeah, that happens." Having been one of my earlier encounters, I obviously said, "What the hell do you mean, that happens? How messed up is this place?" Their answer? Very. Leave it to me to find a career in a place where everyone is just numb to weird, unexplainable stuff. The last story I have is the creepiest one I have to offer. Doors shaking and stuff moving, I can kind of explain away. But this one, well, I can't explain it away easily. Now, I'm not a drinker. I don't smoke weed, never tripped on shrooms or anything like that. The worst I do is smoke and have a caffeine addiction, but whatever. I preface because I need you to know that I was sound of mind and body when I had the following little interaction. One night, as per usual, once the offenders had gone to bed and the place was settled, I was up doing rounds and browsing Reddit for a bit. Most nights at the time were spent browsing Reddit and doing security checks. Not a bad gig, right? Then, I saw some movement going upstairs. Confused, I thought it was my sergeant or another higher-up that came to do their rounds. Figuring I'd break up their solitude, I went and searched for them, for some chatting for the night. I didn't hear boots going up the stairs, but I had a quiet sergeant at the time, and I just called out to them. "Hey, Sergeant Red." There was no response. I turned the stairs to head up, and at the top of the stairs is a door with a window in it. Well, I saw what looked like a white sheet or something that moved away from the door. Weird, laundry was closed, and even if it wasn't, there wasn't a setup for a washer or dryer there anyway. I trotted up the stairs and opened the door, and saw what looked like a woman, in one of those old white nightgowns facing away from me. Also weird, because offenders aren't issued with granny clothes, especially not nightgowns. Okay, this is some kind of weird prank. We had female officers and still do on shift, since the place I work at is all female anyway. So obviously it was one of them having a laugh after being spurred on by one of the sergeants. I rolled my eyes and called out, "Alright, funny, good stuff. I've seen horror movies too, I know the trope. How the hell did you even get a nightgown through the gates anyway? Get a release for it from the warden?" There was no response. She moved into the room. It was a bathroom. Another roll of my eyes, and I made my way towards the room, stopping at the door. I announced my presence, as male staff have to announce before we enter a bathroom for obvious reason, and walked in. I checked the place pretty thoroughly and found, well, no one. The stall doors were open, shower curtains were pulled back, any hiding places were snuffed out. I was clearly seeing stuff, right? Well, my sergeant thought so, since by the time I got back to my office the phone was ringing. My sergeant called me. "Are you okay?" "Well, sort of. I saw you looking all weird and stuff when you left the bathroom." "Yeah. Hey, did you see anyone enter the bathroom before I did?" "Nah, dude, it's like 2 a.m. "Great, so I'm just losing my mind. It's fine." And then I told him about what I saw. He didn't seem too surprised. But this was the same cat that was unsurprised about literally every other weird thing that happened to me. I promise I work with other people besides him. There isn't anything else to that story, no grand discovery of an infamous woman in white or anything so romantic. Just some unanswered questions, like namely, what the hell did I see? I am a 27-year-old female-bodied person. A few months ago, my sister and I wanted to take a late-night trip to our local Kroger for a snack. This was before she moved out, and God do I miss having her in my life. But anyway, as we pulled into the parking lot, there's this beat-up old truck with an older man just sitting there. He looked like he was between 50 and 70. It was hard to tell in the dark, but as I saw him, I got a weird feeling about him. We parked a few feet away and just went on with our business. So we get inside the grocery store, grab what we need, and I got myself and my sister a snack. And my sister got a bottle of wine to share with my mum, as I don't drink. Nothing odd happened in the store until we leave. I noticed that the old pickup truck was now parked next to our Jeep, and I thought it was very odd for the old man to just be parked there when he had several other parking spaces to be. Immediately I get a feeling of dread, as I was a victim of sexual abuse and am typically uncomfortable around older men I don't know. As soon as my sister and I get to the car, the old man steps outside of his vehicle and places his hands on the passenger side door where I would have entered. "Need me to open the door for you, young lady?" he asked in a creepy voice with a smile on his face. No, I think I can get it by myself, thanks. Would you take your hand off the door, please?" I'm on the edge, as the look in this guy's eyes spelled nothing but problems. Thankfully, my sister caught wind of my discomfort and slowly began to pull the wine bottle out of her bag. What happened next made me want to crawl out my skin. The old man obliges and takes his hand off the door for a second to place his hand around my waist. I froze and looked at him like, "Are you serious?" And I felt him pull at me ever so slightly. That's when I heard my sister turn the ignition on, and I got in the car as fast as I could, slamming the door shut in the guy's face. My sister then stepped on the gas and peeled out the parking lot, not even giving the guy a chance to look at me. She told me she wondered why it took me so long to get in, but when she realized what was happening, she was going to bash the guy over the head with her wine if it went any further. I then had a mini panic attack on the way back home, and my dad of course dismissed my feelings and brushed them off as I told him. As did my mum, unfortunately. I did manage to calm down in the end, and now I asked my sister to park a little closer to the entrance to the stores, where there are a lot of lights, in case anything like this ever happens again.
I was studying abroad in Thailand and went with a friend to an island, Koh Samui, for the weekend. Soon after checking into our dinky hotel, we rented motorbikes and cruised around the island, quickly getting lost on the back roads. It was no big deal. We found a little tiki bar and drank the night away, thinking, we'll figure out how to get home eventually. Fast forward to about midnight. We drank enough that motorbiking back to wherever the hell we came from suddenly seemed like a good idea. It's an island, right? Who gets lost on an island? So we set back in the general direction of the hotel. After about an hour of zigzagging around dirt roads, we passed something that smelled terrible, and I turned back to make a sour face at my friend. In a flash, I went off the side of the road and smashed the motorbike into an embankment that was what I assume a swamp of the town's sewage. By the time I realized what happened, I was almost fully submerged in trying to account for my body parts, let alone wipe my face and mouth clear of the revolting slush. I scrambled out, scratched, bruised, and shamed, but in one piece. The motorbike was stuck, half submerged. We yanked it out and somehow got it running again, then limped back towards the hotel. We eventually made it back to the hotel. It must have been at least 3 a.m. I stunk of crap and had a plethora of scratches and bruises that had been marinating for over an hour. So I sprinted to the hotel shower room like my life depended on it. After a few minutes of obsessive scrubbing, I emerged to an empty room with no friend in sight. So I went over to my suitcase to get dressed and looked for him. It was practically empty, save for a few t-shirts and underwear. Strange. I went for my backpack. Nowhere in sight. My friend's backpack. Not there. We were robbed. Frantically, I threw on a shirt and underwear and ran outside to find my friend banging on the door to the lobby, already aware our stuff was missing. Feeling drunk, hungover, and violated in multiple ways, I sprinted over to join him, banging and throwing rocks at the window until someone responded and helped us report the crime. Before long, a little old man poked his head around from the corner of the building. We yelled for his attention and he darted away. We chased. He reappeared this time, wielding a machete. We let out a massive, "Oh crap," and he shouted something that we obviously couldn't understand, and we bolted as fast as we could, running until we were absolutely certain he couldn't find us. Not even sure if he chased, to be honest. We ended up far away at another beach resort. Me, Winnie the Poohing my t-shirt and underwear, and my friend, gross from a day of motorbiking and swamp wading, and had no idea what to do. We had no hotel, no passport, no clothes, and our wallets and phones were back in the recently robbed hotel room, where a little old man was waiting for us with a machete. Defeated, we passed out on the resort's beach chairs and allowed mosquitoes to feast on our helpless bodies until the sun rose. That morning we limped back to the hotel, snuck into the room, grabbed all that was left of our possessions. Thankfully it wasn't robbed twice and our wallets were safe. I bought a bathing suit to wear over my underwear, and then we swiftly got the hell out of that miserable little hell realm of an island. And to this day it remains my most horrible travel/vacation experience, as well as one of my favorite stories to share. Just be careful where you book your hotels, guys.
I'm a psychiatric registered nurse. I worked at a place that was haunted. It had an old hospital prior to being converted into a psychiatric hospital, a place where surgeries were performed, and presumably, a place where patients died. I received phone calls from the police during night shift once, stating that they'd received calls from a little girl and that the calls were coming from our hospital. They were able to give me the extension number of the line, and it turned out that the calls were being made from the arts and crafts room. Nobody goes there at night, ever. As supervisor, I knew where my staff were at all times, and there was never any need for anyone to go in there at night. But patients could possibly have been in there, as there are several locks they'd have to get through first. Also, night shift staffing was minimal, and we were a small 35-bed hospital, so there were only about 6 or 7 of us at any given night. The little girl that would identify herself as Santana, according to the police, would call and ask for help and then hung up. As you can imagine, no girl was ever found. During college, I experienced what I thought was a potential haunting, due to certain events that made my room scary to hang out in. Everyone agrees it was a haunting, especially after we did a ghost hunt and got an EVP. The first event happened while my sister was in school, and parents were on a date, and my grandmother was in her room on the other side of the house. I was napping before heading to school. As I'm laying there, I hear footsteps down the hallway. My door is wide open, so I look out to see no one. I lay back down, and then the door slowly creaks closed. I roll over, and it slams shut. Panicking, I start yelling at my family, but no one says anything. I text everyone, and they're still where they were. I feel creeped out but try ignoring it. That is until the door slowly creaks back open, and once again I see no one. I start yelling for my grandmother, and I hear her door open and start making her way towards me. I'm staring at the hallway but see nothing aside from her walking towards me, and I begin freaking out, explaining to her what's going on. And right as she reaches my room, the door slams shut. She too is shaken by this, quickly opening my door and rushing me to her room. This type of event never happened again. The next thing to happen is in regards to the heat event. Now everyone would think an animal would be responsible, but how do you explain it being pushed out and hearing constant scratches when there are no animals to be seen, both in the vent and under the housing during said events? To explain what exactly happened, I'll talk about the events and the vent itself. You can find it at the foot of my bed, which is where my sister's bed is now. It was positioned between my bed and the television, and then my computer was to the right, and a wall was to the left. Not long after the door event, I was playing with my computer and started hearing faint scratches. Living in the woods, you get used to animals under your manufactured home. Well, it was weird, but I ignored it, until there was a banging against the vent. It looked like something was pushing up against it. I picked up my feet just in case, and just watched it, but nothing else happened. A few nights of this happening, my dad decided to check it out. Putting on gloves, he lifted off the vent, but nothing happened. The scratches continued without the vent being in place. My dad lowered a camera in there, but nothing was in the vent. He then went outside to look under the house. The siding came off easily, and still saw nothing but heard the scratches. We kept an eye on it, even having an exterminator check it out, but nothing came up. I started freaking out over the idea of something grabbing my feet, and so began putting my huge textbooks on top of the vent. I'd hear the scratches go on all night, fall asleep, then wake up to the books toppled over and the vent popped out. Nothing ever showed itself in my room. I had the door locked because my boyfriend lived in the room with me, so no one was coming in to mess with the books. This went on for months just before stopping abruptly. The night it stopped, we had another event. This was just simple but scary as heck. My boyfriend and I were sleeping. We noticed that the scratches were gone, and were in thought, wondering what was going on. As we lay there in the dark, we feel pressure on our legs. Our blanket is literally being ripped off us, downwards as if being pulled towards the vent. We panic and scream and then turn on the light, only to find that the vent is in place along with the books. This also never happened again. The last event that happened and sparked my sister to have us try ghost hunting was a few days later during the beginning of summer term. My boyfriend was at his laptop on the bed and I was on my computer. Our door was open and we were just there playing Aeon. All of a sudden, my bedstead curtains start swaying in the door like someone just walked in. I look down and literally see a dark, childlike figure crawling on the floor right by my doorway. The curtains are scrunched around it. It had holes where the eyes would have been. I freaked out, and it's just gone in a flash, but my sister in the other room, along with my boyfriend and I, hear what sounds like quick crawling down the hallway. This freaked us out, and we decided to go ghost hunting that weekend. I put up a cheap camera that my mum had gifted me and set it on my computer desk and aimed it at the vent. It had no night function, so it captured mostly sound. We take our 3 phones, all the same kind, and use each one to either film, take pictures, or voice record. We ensure everyone is hanging outside and turn off the electricity. When we went around looking throughout the rooms, nothing is found at first, until we listened to the recordings on the cheap camera. During the time we were getting ready, while we were in the hallway and about to close the door, we picked up what sounded like a dog breathing in the mic. It breathes normally as we're speaking, but then stops, sucking in a breath like it's been caught. When my boyfriend thinks he hears something weird in my room, it then began breathing for a few seconds before stopping again. When I responded, "What?" in a panicked way before breathing a moment, then stopping again. The breaths happen in between us all talking, as if it wouldn't be noticed, but then stops right as we start talking. It's almost as if something or someone was hiding in my room. Obviously, there wasn't, since my room was so small that my bed was in the closet and didn't have doors, and there was no space under my bed for anyone to hide. This EVP is the only thing found, and it was beginning in my room. We had shut the door after leaving, and nothing abnormal happened when we opened it. The vent was intact, the camera was in the same place. It creeped us out though that I slept with the TV on just in case. After that was discovered, we uploaded it to YouTube and went on with life. Nothing scary ever happened again. Luckily, I even had someone clean up the clip for me, and they confirmed that there were a total of 4 different voices. The breathing was there no matter how much they edited it, and they couldn't explain exactly what it was, but they thought maybe it was an animal. We did have a cat, but she was in her pet carrier outside during the hunt. Whatever it was, made for an odd experience I will never forget. I work at a psych ward that used to be a hospital in California. All stories happened during third shift between midnight and 8:30 a.m. The first thing was on the adolescent unit. Staff used to see a teenage girl enter one of the rooms, specifically 302. So many times, the patients that were in that room, not knowing anything about it, would see this girl sitting on the window still crying. I had one of the patients refuse to even sleep in there after seeing the girl. The patient was not schizo, nor had any type of impaired visual hallucination. Now, at this psych ward, you also have a woman that numerous staff have seen on a psych unit that we call Adult F. It used to be a maternity unit when it was a hospital, and supposedly the girl went into labor, lost one of the twins during birth, and also died. You can hear her saying, "Where's my baby?" over and over. The next one is on the children's unit. So my uncle works on the children's unit. About 2 years ago, a tech, someone that also works the unit, comes into the nurse's station saying to my uncle, "I just saw a kid go into the day room, and I went to go check it out, and no one was there." So my uncle puts up the security cameras, and both my uncle and the tech are watching the cameras, only to see this person appear on the camera and just stand there. Immediately both of them jumped back, and the tech said, "He's going to break." It left them scared out of their minds for the remaining 2 hours. This next story is also on the children's unit. So the one tech I know is watching a suicide patient, which basically is a 1-to-1, and you're just making sure they don't do anything. The tech is sitting and watching the patient, and this little girl comes up to him and asks if she can get a glass of water. He says, "I can't get it for you, sweetie. You have to wait till the nurse comes back on the unit." She says, "Okay," and goes back to her room. He watched the girl go into her room. So the nurse comes back, and the tech asks the nurse that the girl in 202 wants water. The nurse says there isn't anyone assigned to that room. No girls were on that unit during the day. So the last one. The nurse I know was working on an adult unit for third shift. She said she was taking a selfie in the nurse's station and looked around to make sure there was no one around in the halls, or no patients or anything, because, HIPPA. Well, she takes the picture, and about a week later is showing her friend. Her friend asked her who the guy in the background was. She showed the picture, and it was a tall, black figure. I'll have to ask her if she still has it. The only time I saw anything paranormal was in the children's unit. I heard children running in the hall at night while everyone was asleep. And when I go to the day room at night, I get a very frightening feeling.
A few years ago, we went on a church trip to one of our favorite concerts that runs on New Year's Eve to celebrate the new year. Not only is it concerts, it has all kinds of other events and things to do beside the music. We decided to go super last minute, and a lot of the hotels in the area were booked. We ended up staying in a rinky-dink little roadside motel, about a half hour from all the events, and pretty much in the middle of nowhere. The entire place was sketchy, and made me uncomfortable, but I felt like we could deal with it. So, we were separated, boys in a room, girls in a room, and then chaperones. We get into the room and the first thing we notice is a back door. What kind of hotel has a back door? The chaperones staying next door insisted that it's sealed shut, but still let us know if anyone knocks on it to not hesitate to let them know by knocking on the wall or whatever. No sooner than 5 minutes later, one of the guys comes to our room and, jealous of our back door, throws it open, proving that it wasn't sealed shut as we were told. We locked it and went about our business. Late that night at about 11:30 to midnight, we get back to our hotel and our chaperones tell us to lock the doors because there were men sitting outside drinking, very obviously drunk, as they started catcalling us because we went to our room. I didn't think much of it and slammed and locked the door, which the young girls in our room decided would be completely okay to always answer without looking first, because, well, why would they be knocking on our door if they didn't know us, was their logic. Not okay. And I had to explain to them that you always need to look to see who you're opening for, obviously. Anyway, late that night, I was woken up by an odd sound, almost like tapping. I sat up and glanced around the room before I realized someone was knocking on our door. I very quietly got out of bed, careful to move as silently as possible, and went to the door to check on the peephole. No sooner had I glanced out, a hand slowly covered the peephole to hide two of the men that had been drinking outside earlier, and my heart started racing. I slowly got back to bed, trying to stay quiet and calm as the knocking persisted, only to see a shadow move out of the corner of my eye, and realize there was someone standing there, the back door as well, barely visible through the blurry tinted window. One of the girls I was with woke up too. Confused, she looked at me. I used my phone to explain the situation silently, as we both waited, terrified, as we watched the shadows through the window and hoped they would leave soon. At some point we both managed to fall asleep again, but when I left the room the next morning, there was a paper on the ground in very shaky, messy handwriting, and it read, "Seeing your pretty eye was enough." I can still remember that note perfectly, even after I shredded it and flushed it down the toilet to avoid anyone finding it. I was young and stupid. Looking back now, I know 100% I should have went straight to a chaperone and told them what happened. It could have been a very dangerous situation, and I'm extremely grateful that I was awoken rather than one of the other younger girls, who would have probably opened the door without checking. I'm also grateful that I triple-checked the doors to make sure they were locked. However, at the same time, it also didn't seem like a big deal to me. Nothing came of it besides extreme paranoia for a while. But all in all, the only long-term bad effect was a permanent bad feeling and fear of roadside motels.
I work overnight security in one of the largest, best, and oldest hospitals in the US. My fellow security officers and I have stories about one building in particular, but the one I'm about to tell is the one that happened to me. Backstory for the building: it was built in the late 1800s. It was the original psychiatric building for the hospital. Now, being the late 1800s, not much was truly known about psychiatric disorders. On top of that, the hospital was known for its medical research. With both of these facts combined, you can infer that some terrible stuff was done to the misunderstood psych patients in this building. A few years before I started working security there, this building had been converted into offices after the newly built part of the hospital dedicated a section for an updated psych ward. And now, it's time for my story. My rounds for that night happened to include said building. At night, this building was empty due to recently being converted into offices, and the drones who worked there wanting to leave promptly at 5, if not earlier. In some of their haste, they left their office doors unlocked, which is a big no-no due to medical information being located in said offices. It was our duty to go to each floor and make sure every door was locked, and if it wasn't, to secure it ourselves. I did my initial sweep of the building to make sure it was clear, and that there was nobody in the building, and proceeded to do my door checks. The hallways were pretty narrow, so I could check both sides of the hallway doors at once. At the end of this hallway, there were 2 sets of doors you had to go through to reach the final office, which was a dead end. Everything was secure. Awesome. Time for the next floor. I exited the 2 sets of doors from the dead-end office and stood absolutely frozen from what I saw. Every door ajar, set perfectly so their own weight wouldn't cause them to shut again, and 1 wheelchair at the end of said hallway, facing towards the steps. I had heard other security officers outright reject that set of rounds due to strange stuff happening there, but I laughed it off until that night happened, and I never took those rounds again. The old children's ICU is currently under construction to be turned into medical labs, so we have to patrol the area. Once again, to make sure the area is secure, or to report it to the contractor/foreman, planned for the next day. When patrolling this area, several security officers have reported seeing a single white male child, around the age of 5 to 7, with short brown hair. Think 90s bowl cut. I personally dismissed this, as this was before the psych ward incident, as a tall tale told with the intent to scare me, because I was new at the time. I got that building's patrol one night, and a foreman who stayed late called security and asked for a security officer to come up because a kid had locked himself in a room, and I didn't want him to get hurt with all the open wires in there, or something to that effect. I unlocked the door for him, looked in what could only be a 10 by 8 room for about 10 minutes, and there was no kid. I called it in as a false alarm and finished my patrol. There was another occasion when I had a special detail, aka babysitting a violent psych patient, along with another security officer. He woke up in the middle of the night, recognized the other officer and said hello. He sees me, and immediately began screaming at me to not hurt him. Now I'm a rather large gentleman, 6'2" and 250 pounds, but I try not to make myself too intimidating around psych patients as to not escalate the situation. He keeps screaming for me not to hurt him, and he says if I promise not to, he would make something good happen for me. I promise, he calms down, goes back to sleep, and I forget about it. Next day, I got a permanent set of rounds and a pretty good promotion. Easily a coincidence. but I thought it was interesting nonetheless. A fellow security officer had rounds in the aforementioned psych building. He heard a call on the radio in what could only be described as a dry-throat voice of terror for one officer for backup. So I responded to his call by letting him know I was on my way. When I got there, he had his head between his knees and was silently crying with a shattered chandelier a few feet next to him. Before I had experienced the abnormal happenings in the building, I would have written off his testimony as idiocy, but he claims that something held him in that spot as the chandelier started swinging wildly until it began to fall. When it started to fall, he was let go and allowed to move, and he scrambled out of the way before it hit him. He got up, calmed down, and took him back to the supervisor. She yelled at one of our other supervisors, "Almost lost another one in that building." The other supervisor laughed and said, "Why do you think we only send in the new guys? You know I don't even like going there." That guy is my roommate, and always hates when I bring up that experience.
My family was on vacation in Florida, I think near Orlando. I was 16 at the time. We had just settled into our hotel room, and we were hungry. So my parents went out to get pizza. I was really tired, so I decided to stay in the room. A little while later, I hear knocking at the door. So I get up and go to open it, assuming that it was my parents with the food. But I decide to try and look through the peephole first, just to be sure. That's when I saw there were two guys with their faces covered, attempting to open the door. I backed up and can hear them twisting the knob and pushing. So I freaked out and screamed, "Get out! We're calling the cops!" I grabbed the hotel phone and started calling the lobby, telling them what was happening, and I heard whoever they were start running down the hall. Staff showed up, but they didn't find whoever they were, at least not to my knowledge. My parents showed up a little while later and talked to the staff and all that, but I was pretty shaken, and it was definitely not a fun way to start summer break.
I work on a busy surgical floor and do 2 12-hour days, then 2 nights, and then off for 4. During my day shift, I had a patient who was only in his early 50s but had terminal cancer and was in extreme pain, as it was all throughout his bones. He decided to undergo physician-assisted suicide and asked that I be in assistance. The doctor came and performed the procedure on my second day shift. The next night, I came in for my shift and had a new patient that was a 45-year-old man who had just had a small bowel resection staying in that room, and he got back from surgery that morning, was totally clear, walking around okay, and was only taking Tramadol for pain. He was completely oriented and not confused whatsoever. Anyway, around 3 a.m., he comes around and starts ringing his bell, and I go to his room, and he asks me why this other patient keeps coming into his room and telling him to leave. He seemed genuinely freaked out and a bit annoyed, so I asked him to describe the patient, and he did. I couldn't really think of any other patients on that floor that fit the profile. This entire time, our care aide was sitting outside his room, charting on her mobile workstation, and she just so happened to be parked near his room. I asked if she saw anyone, and she said no, so I started looking in all the rooms, but everyone was asleep. I told the guy I'm not sure who it was, but if he bothered him again to ring right away and let one of us know. 45 minutes later, Buddy rings again, and it's the same thing. I look around and couldn't see anyone. The care aide was still there, and she said no one had been out that she saw. I asked for the description of the guy again, and this time I wrote it down, as I was going to tell security, and, as he's describing the guy, he mentions this fish tattoo on the forearm, and I think, weird. The guy in here before who died had a tattoo like this in his forearm. Then I told that to the care aide, and she was the one who then mentioned that it sounded like the guy who died, and I got freaked out. and we were both really creeped out after that. I just told the guy to go back to bed and that we were dealing with it in the hallway. I have never been so creeped out in all my life. I grew up in a suburb right outside of Montreal in Quebec. Most of the homes in this particular area were built in the 50s and 60s. There was this house, number 217, that my mum always admired. She knew the owners and would help the lady carry her groceries home. 20 years later, this house went up for sale and my mother begged my father to put in an offer. They had just experienced a large financial loss, and my dad wasn't ready to buy another home. However, to please my mother, he provided an offer he could afford. This offer was way below what they were asking, yet they accepted the offer without question. The house at the time had been owned by the previous couple's son. I was 9, and my sister was 6 when we moved into 217. My parents owned the home for 22 years, in which the only comfortable years were the last 7. To say the house was haunted was an understatement. So much so, we rarely speak of it today. People always questioned how people stay in homes like these, but my parents struggled a lot during this time, so a move was never possible and not affordable. There are many stories, but the one I'm going to tell you is about the one that completely flipped my mum out and had her demand to my father to find help to be rid of them. Sharing this story so many years later is giving me chills and actually making me feel uncomfortable. But I will proceed. My bedroom, you see, was the most active. It was at the back of the house and had a huge window. One night, I was exceptionally frightened to go to sleep. My mum said she'd stay with me that night, as she could see that I was visibly shaken. Mind you, I was over 20 at this point and not a little girl. There had been nightly occurrences, and I was done. That night I had a dream. In the dream it was a super still winter morning. The sun wasn't up yet, and I could hear the wind. I was at a bus stop, and there was a group of about a dozen people standing behind me in a perfect semicircle. Everyone was fully covered, face as well, with scarves and gloves, so I couldn't see their faces. So I wondered if the reason I couldn't see their faces was because I wasn't wearing my glasses. I reached into my pocket and pulled them out. Suddenly there was an elderly man in front of me. He grabbed both sides of my glasses with these super thick brown leather gloves and helped me slip them onto my face. I believe he spoke too, but it's been near 30 years and I've forgotten that part. Before I could focus in my glasses, I woke up. I felt a heavy weight against my back and thought it was odd. Why is my mum so close to me? That's when it gets really weird. I realized I was lying on my stomach. I looked over and saw my mum. She was at least 1.5 feet away from me and asleep. I began to panic. I slowly tried to get up, yet the more I tried, the heavier the pressure against my back got. I counted to 3 and jumped from the bed quickly. I felt whatever it was roll off the bed, and I heard it run out the room. I looked over, and my mum was sitting up on the bed with a look of incredible fear in her eyes. "Did you see that?" she asked. So I said, "No, but I had a weird dream." She asked me to tell her first. I do. She then proceeds to tell me what she saw. She said she woke up and turned to see me. Now, to give you perspective as to how she saw this, the large bed in this room was pushed up against the wall, and I had been sleeping on that side. She said the wall looked as though she had just been looking at a large movie screen, like a projected image, in which she saw a semicircle of spirits in a shadow form surround me in a semicircle. She then said, I opened my eyes and said to her, "Mummy, don't worry, they like me." She looked up, and hovering above me was another spirit. At that moment, she said, I shot up, and suddenly, the spirit floating above me flipped around off the bed and out the room, and she heard it run out the room too. That morning, my mum had enough. We had endured this house for long enough, and she and my dad found someone to remove the spirits. They finally succeeded with the help of multiple people, and they finally enjoyed the home for 7 more years. But we often felt that they never really left. To this day, the number 217 gives me the creeps. Typing this out now is making me feel uneasy. My sister never wants to talk about the house, and she too gets goosebumps just seeing that number. I wonder if the people who live there now feel the same. A long time ago when I was 17, I was fresh out of CNA training and pretty naive. This was my first job and I loved working with the elderly. I liked the way it made me feel, like I was doing something positive to help people. One thing they don't train you on is for strange and unexplainable things that you will see. It started off as just another quiet night, with nothing going on. We were sitting in our nursing station and everything was quiet, and the patients were all sleeping. It was about mid-shift, around midnight, when I heard it. A loud, eerie moan from down the hall. A lady called Mary. The other CNAs had told me about her, that sometimes she would just wake up and start moaning, like she was incredibly sad or mournful. Before I could get down the hall, she had moaned a few more times. I was heading down to her room when suddenly the fire doors slammed shut. It made me jump because there was nothing going on that would have caused them to close like that. There's no fire alarm, no smoke I can smell, then why did they shut? It was so unexpected. I stopped walking to look around, and I looked around to see who else could have done it, but there was no one there. Just then, the other 2 CNAs on shift came to see what was going on. The doors to the other 2 halls had shut as well. We decided there was no fire, but we did a round on each hall just to make sure. As I was doing my rounds, I got to Mary's room and saw she was awake. The only patients we found who were awake, and no sooner had I started helping her did she start moaning again, and I couldn't believe it. In my short time working there, I had never witnessed her behave like this before. This little old lady didn't speak, was bent and stiff from arthritis, and light as a feather. How could such a small, frail lady make such a huge noise? After I finished helping Mary, I went to the next room on my hall and found that the lady in that room had passed away. As soon as I stepped into her room, Mary stopped moaning and didn't make a peep for the rest of the night. I quickly notified my nurses and started getting her ready, and called the family to come and pay their final respects. As I worked, I wondered, could she have been trying to let us know? How could she have known? To this day, I don't know how she knew, but each time someone passed away, she would moan until the person was found, and the fire doors would shut on each end of the hall. I work LTC on a dementia unit. We had a resident who was our baby. She had been a don of a nursing home and would stay up until midnight with us talking about work, asking about med pass, etc. She was always a nurse at heart. She got really bad and ended up in bed in about August. She wouldn't eat nor drink. I think maybe she took 360 cc a day for the first week. Eventually nothing. It took her nearly 4 weeks of nothing to finally pass. I took a week's vacation on week 3. I said my final goodbyes, came back, still kicking. I couldn't believe it. She passed in September. So since she had passed, we have had 2 patients in her room. One was a lady who had a stroke, rehabbed to home. Pretty with it, and she would turn on her call light and whisper, "There's a lady in my bed." We would reassure her, show her the empty bed, and this went on her entire stay. She kept seeing a lady in her bed. One of her last nights, she rings crying, "There's a lady in my room. I know you don't believe me, but it's true. You don't want to believe me." Patient number 2 still resides in that room, an older gentleman with dementia. He rings every so often saying there's a lady in his bed or a lady in his room. I bet it's got to be our cute old Don resident. In the summer of 2015, I was 33 years old, broke and jobless in Mexico City. My entire life had gone steadily down the drain for the past few years, and my best friend had moved back to Europe. I was tired and bored, so when an online friend I had met in person 2 years before invited me to spend a month in his farmhouse in Norway, I accepted without hesitation. The deal was simple. In exchange for some work at the farm, I would get some pretty sweet holidays in a country I had always wanted to visit. I have no problem doing labor work. In fact, I was always looking forward to do it and to get my body into real action. Since I had moved back to Mexico City from Canada in 2011, I had been feeling rusted and soft, so I packed my suitcase, put on my boots, and said goodbye to Mexico City the best way I knew how, by getting absolutely pissed drunk. I arrived to Stavanger in Norway, but my suitcase decided to go to Thailand instead. I think it got the better deal. So after an hour filling the reports in and giving the address of my friend's house, I was able to walk out and meet him again. My friend Harold was standing there, confused and annoyed. He told me later he was about to leave the airport thinking I had decided to not take the flight after all. Guess I was lucky. That night, I spent it with Harold and his friends in an oceanfront apartment in a quiet neighborhood in Stavanger, getting drunk on Norwegian beer and smoking weed. The next day, Harold drove me all the way to his farmhouse about an hour south of Stavanger, in a community called Ergesund. At least, that's what I think it was called. Norwegian names and addresses were weird if you're not familiar with them. The land Harold owned was huge and beautiful. Not really sure how it all works, but in his property there's a lighthouse that attracts a lot of tourists from all over Europe. The house itself was located on top of a small hill, with a huge barn next to it. Harold lived alone in the 2-story house, but I was told the basement housed a tenant. As soon as I glanced the basement window, I got a strange feeling of dread. There was a webcam facing the driveway, and the rest of the window was covered by boxes and papers, but I decided not to mention it to Harold, since he didn't seem to care. I just assumed the guy was an eccentric man, or maybe a normal precaution considering we were more or less in the middle of nowhere, with no neighboring houses, just separated by big fields. I took my mind off things and focused on the joy of being in Norway. After being installed in one of the bedrooms upstairs, I was informed that that week, Harold's son's wedding was going to be celebrated, and thus the house would need to be filled with the bride's family from Bergen. I think, anyway. In general, it was great to meet them, but on my second night when everyone had gone to sleep, and Harold and I were still up chatting and drinking beer, I got to meet the tenant, Olaf. Harold had been having some trouble with his new smartphone, and apparently Olaf was tech-savvy, and had indeed been the one purchasing the phone for Harold. We went downstairs to his basement. Now Harold kept telling me that he didn't like Olaf, and was actually upset by the way Olaf kept the newly remodeled basement. From what I understood, they had some kind of relationship more than just landlord and tenant. The basement was dark, all the windows covered, and piles of junk cluttered the entire place. The bedroom was full of computer parts and electronic junk. He had blinking and beeping things everywhere, and he invited us to sit down, and when he turned on a desk lamp to check Harold's phone, I got the first real good look of him. He was in his mid-40s but looked older. Shaved head, really skinny, big nose and deep shadows under his eyes. He had the entire look of a meth addict. I should know, since I worked in a recovery house in Surrey, British Columbia, Canada. I had seen the same face back then in the people who were dealing with severe addictions. The way he stuttered only confirmed further my observations, and I decided that I had to keep an eye on him. My gut told me right then and there he was trouble. Olaf finished with Harold's phone, and then directed his attention to me, and asked me if I would like to see some porn. to which I declined entirely. I just wanted to leave the dark and oppressive basement. Harold laughed a drunken laughter and asked Olaf if he had gay porn, to which Olaf said he didn't care about the sexuality of the videos. He simply liked to see people getting things introduced to them. When he said that, I got chills running down my spine, and I asked myself if he meant in a sexual way or if there was a more ominous meaning to it. But we didn't stay to find out. Harold had a busy day, and the next day I was tired and thoroughly creeped out by him. When we were back in the house, I asked Harold if he trusted his friend, to which he replied that Olaf wasn't his friend. He was just an addict renting the basement. The government paid Harold to rent, and a nurse visited him twice a week to bring him his medication. After dropping that bomb, he said goodnight and went to his bedroom. I tried not to think about Olaf, but between my gut feeling and him popping into the house unannounced when everyone else was preparing for the wedding that weekend, I couldn't really relax. The first time he went inside was to give me a flash drive with movies he had downloaded for me from the internet. He made sure to emphasize that it was illegal. The second time, he seemed high and wanted to simply let me know that if I needed anything I could ask him, but asked me to not tell Harold about him going up. He said that and then walked out very slowly and carefully, as if he knew he would fall if he rushed. When the wedding was over and the house was again empty, except for Harold and I, the encounters with Olaf became stranger and more often. One time while I was in the kitchen fixing myself some breakfast, I turned around to find Olaf standing on the kitchen door, bleeding from his nose, staring at me. I jumped out of my skin and dropped my breakfast, creating a huge mess, but he didn't seem to notice and simply started babbling incoherently, while directing his cloudy eyes to the ceiling on top of my head. I was petrified, trying to think of a train of actions that wouldn't trigger a violent response from him. He simply turned around and quietly walked out of the house. I started locking the door whenever I was alone in the house since that day. When I told Harold about it, he got visibly mad and went downstairs to talk and yell to Olaf. Harold told me he didn't like to have him in the basement, and he had tried to kick him out several times, but the government had always ruled against evicting him. And Harold's sister was mostly responsible for it. She felt bad for the guy and was 100% on Olaf's side just because he had the same number as her father. Go figure. So Harold had to learn to live with him in the basement, but only because Olaf was supposed to clean and in treatment for his addiction. After that day, Olaf stopped being friendly with me and just became a cold, impassive presence in my life there. There was one day when I was in the barn chatting with a couple of Harold's friends when Olaf entered the barn to place his laptop and some homemade-looking gadget on the window. Despite no one asking, he began to explain to everyone that he was using it to hack into people's networks to get their Wi-Fi password. You know, like everyone does, right? He gave me a nasty glare, and then I stormed out. I turned to Harold's friends and told them I was completely afraid of him, and I had this feeling that he would attack me one day. Harold's friends told me that it would never happen, but that if I felt I was in real danger, I could give them a call and they would pick me up. We exchanged numbers, hugged, and said goodbye for the night. The next day, things between Harold and me turned sour, mostly because I wasn't feeling safe anymore, and I had expressed my wish to instead go to Germany to visit the man who was now my husband. Apparently, Harold had hoped for us to go closer, but he had failed to let me know. In the end, I was exhausted, and I didn't want to deal with that anymore. I should mention that Harold has a severe alcohol problem that I wasn't aware of until the month I spent with him, seeing him get absolutely wasted on a daily basis. To some that might be attractive, but not me. So altogether the situation went from bad to worse, and I wanted out. I'd done my job, I'd done nothing wrong, and I wanted to be able to relax away from both of them. The night I decided to organize my flight to Germany from Norway, Harold went out to get drunk and didn't come back until the early hours of the morning the next day. I had tried to stay up and wait for him to talk, but I must have fallen asleep at some point. I woke up to the sound of the front door being closed, and I caught a glance of him walking towards the barn with the dog and a six-pack of beers through the living room window. I then tried to send him a message through Facebook, but soon discovered the internet was down. That's weird, I thought. In the whole time I had been there, the internet never failed, not even once. I went to the router and restarted it a few times to no avail, and decided to just let it be. Perhaps Harold had cut the internet as a way of a drunken, childish punishment. So I would just get on my morning routine and have breakfast before going to knock on the barn door. That would give him some time to blow off some steam, I thought. I went downstairs to the bathroom, got comfortably naked and jumped into the shower ready to refresh myself and sing a few songs to lift my spirits in preparation for the grim talk that awaited me with Harold. Halfway through the first song, I heard a loud bang coming from the front door, followed by someone screaming my name. I thought Harold must be very drunk and angry. I sighed while turning off the shower, thinking I was going to have a long argument, when the bathroom door slammed open. And that is when I saw, to my horror, Olaf coming at me with a completely deranged expression on his face, wielding a big cutter knife, the kind employees use in warehouses to open boxes. For a few seconds I didn't think or focus on anything other than the knife in his hand, and the fact that I was naked, wet, and cornered in a small bathroom in the middle of nowhere in Norway. I was paralyzed. My biggest fear was actually happening. I couldn't scream or move, I just stared at the knife. He kept pulling and pushing, making that now horrifying noise those blades do while operated. I was about to pass out when Olaf's screams brought me back to the gravity of the situation. He was yelling me, accusing me of playing Harold's feelings. He was calling me a liar, a filthy Mexican, and throwing in some threats about cutting me open and messing with me if I ever tried to take anything from Harold. That, I think, is what got my gears moving again. He called me a thief. I can be whatever, but I'm no thief and I'm not a liar. So standing there getting myself angry at the psycho in front of me threatening my life, my training from the recovery house in Canada kicked in. I remembered the rules from when dealing with altered addicts. Make eye contact, keep your hands down so that you don't startle them, and speak to them in a calm but dominant voice, and always, always, always refer to them by their name. And that is exactly what I did. Despite the fear and certainty of me being stabbed to death, I stared at him in his cloudy, crazy wide eyes and said, "Olaf, you are the thief. You're the one who keeps stealing Harold's silverware. Olaf, you are the one who keeps breaking into the house. Olaf, Harold is not your friend. Harold doesn't even want you living here." It was a long shot, but it worked. My words made him confused, and I was able to take one single small step forward, while making him take one small step back. Then he charged at me again with his rant, wielding the knife to my chest and neck. I could feel the cold sweat dripping on my back, and a burning void forming in my stomach every time he launched the knife forward. But I didn't flinch. I stood my ground and kept repeating the same words to him, every time gaining another step, pushing him little by little out of the bathroom. He might have noticed what I was doing, but by then it was too late. When he took the last steps out of the bathroom door frame, I moved as fast as my terrorized body would allow me to, slammed the door on his stupid, crooked nose, and locked it, and immediately pushed against it with all my body while a storm of curses, punches, and kicks rained on the little farmhouse door. I remember praying to a God I didn't really believe to hold the door in place and to keep the addict out. There was nothing that I could use in the bathroom to defend myself. Nothing against an infuriated high psychopath wielding a knife and a possibly broken nose. After what seemed to have been an eternity, I felt, at long last, a very strong kick to the door, and then to my relief he stormed out of the house, with a loud bang of the front door announcing his exit. However, I stayed put for another 20 minutes, not able to breathe or think anything else than keeping the door closed. I wanted to puke, but I couldn't move. Eventually my senses came back, and I knew I had to act quickly. I opened the door to the bathroom, flew upstairs, got dressed, and then exited the house through the window to the garden. I knew he could hear me moving on the first floor, and he had his stupid camera spying on the driveway. I jumped to the garden, jumped the fence, and ran around the house to the barn. I kicked and banged and screamed for Harold to let me in, but it was useless. He was living his drama, and I needed help. So I ran all the way to the next house where his sister lived, rang the bell, and when she opened, I explained to her as best I could what happened. She didn't speak a word of English, so it was a comical exchange for about 10 minutes, until her expression shifted from confusion to absolute terror mirroring my own. She walked me up to the barn, opened the door, commanded Harold to guard me, and went straight to the basement to confront Olaf. I was shocked and shaking, still trying to explain to Harold what had just happened. His drunken state was gone by the time I was done. He too went to the basement, and I could hear the screams. They took him out. Their sister and her husband got Olaf in the car and took him away. Harold stayed with me all day. I drank so much beer but didn't get drunk, even though I wanted to. I wanted to forget but simply couldn't. I was told that Olaf admitted to having the knife, and that his intentions were to make me fight him. So in reality, he wanted an excuse to stab the Jesus out of my naked butt. After all, he liked to see people have things introduced to them, right? That night, I slept in the house while Harold kept guard of the house. I had some tools with me to defend myself, and of course I slept fully dressed. A horrible night. The next morning we went to the police to file a report, but even the cops seemed baffled and couldn't believe that something like that could ever happen in their small, peaceful, picture-perfect community. But they believed me, and the cop who took my statement asked me if there was somewhere I could go while they sorted out all this mess with Olaf. I told them that I was planning to visit Germany the very next day. That last day I barely spoke with Harold. I didn't blame him, but he told me that in his drunken state, he had told Olaf that I was leaving, and he was sad about it. Since Olaf had been doing drugs all night, he understood that he had to defend Harold. So Olaf cut off the internet, waited for me to go into the shower, and went upstairs to do his job. I left Norway without a single word and without looking back. They told me I could testify via Skype whenever the trial started, so they took my information down and promised justice would be served. It's been more than a year now, and I've never heard a squeak from the police. When I asked Harold about it, he told me the police dropped the case for lack of evidence, and that Olaf is back in Harold's basement doing whatever it is he does. Life goes on, and I was angry for a while, but even anger goes away if there's nothing to burn. I tried to focus on the good things in life, and life itself. Every day is a gift, or a chance, but the shadow of fear never really left me. I keep looking over my shoulder, keep studying people in case I have to defend myself, and I still have a sense of dread whenever I take a shower, especially at the gym where I'm most vulnerable. I can't help thinking that anyone else would have ended up with a bloated corpse in a pool of blood in that shower, unnoticed for hours and hours, maybe days, until someone had to use that bathroom. If I had done something differently, if Olaf hadn't been so high to be intimidated by my words, that bloated corpse would have been me. I still don't know how to get rid of the thought. But all I know is that Olaf is free, and I really, really, really don't ever want to meet him again. During my younger years, I worked as an ME's assistant in a small town out in the boonies. We had little to do, mostly car accidents, the odd workplace death, once or twice a suicide, and of course anyone dying in medical care because that's the law. As death professionals, we were the least superstitious people on the planet. We knew that dead people are dead. We don't have the usual fear of dead bodies and gore, and those who come to us as fresh new employees shed whatever fears they have and move on quickly. One evening we receive a freshly deceased male in his late 50s. The man had been hauling freight from Galveston up into the heartland on an 18-wheeler, apparently done his body no service with a mix of trucker speed, smokes, fatty diner food, and beer by the barrel, and one night it just all caved in on him, leading to the cleaning staff of the motel he'd been staying at to find him when he didn't check out. The autopsy had already been done a few days ago. The cause of death was determined, and he'd been moved to one of the walk-in coolers we used to store bodies for transport home. They walk in with this big industrial cooler that they use in restaurants or warehouses with those rubber curtains and a massive lockable door. I grabbed the key from the ring to tag the body and bag it for transport. We bagged every body back then, because Southwestern Airlines was our main air transport, and they didn't have the pressure boxes bodies get put into to prevent, seepages. The pickup worker was on his way, and I had 30 minutes to get everything done. Paperwork, tagging, double-checking we had the right person, all that. With the medical examiner's papers in hand, I went to bag our trucker, opened the door, slid his metal slab onto the cart, and wheeled him into the autopsy anteroom, and pulled the bag onto him. There's a science to doing this alone. Humans are freaking unwieldy and heavy. After putting him in and readjusting his slipped face, as many of you may be unaware, the medical examiner makes an incision around the back of the head and pulls all the flesh down from the cranium to open up the skull and inspect the brain. Nice. I zipped the bag shut and went to grab the outer tag I'd printed beforehand. One-use body bags have a double zipper, one at the bottom, one at the top. When a body is moved, no matter where, the mover has to check the name and number on the paperwork with the name and number on the bag and the name and number on the toe tag. I left the room, and when I came back to the top, the bag was standing open, exposing the trucker's face, with the slipped face and his jaw ajar, as it would be when all muscular function is gone. He looked like he gave me a crooked smile. I zipped the bag shut, scolded myself for not doing my job right, checked paperwork against the toe and the new tag, and zipped the bottom shut after checking, placing the tag and wheeling him back. A little later, the driver arrived. I handed her a cup of coffee and the paperwork and went to fetch the body. When I opened the cooler, the trucker smiled at me again. Had I pulled the bottom zipper too wide and the top one open? I did the whole check all tags and paperwork thing, closed the face part and wheeled him out. We sat in the break room for a few minutes while the driver finished her coffee, talked about the Rams and the disastrous Cowboy game a few days back, and she walked out. "Dude, you sure you're done with him?" I heard her holler. As she was outside and standing at the entrance of the room, I went over to her. The bag had opened again. A toothy, crooked grin was staring right at us. I knew for a fact I'd closed the bag. The scientist in me says it was a faulty bag with tension issues. The rest of me? Yeah, I'm not too sure.
I'm now going to share with you a story that happened a few years back, in a hostel room in a not-so-great part of London. I happened to be awake at the night. The rooms are a bit stuffy, and I was considering opening a window. It was dark, but there is some light entering the room from a nearby streetlight, so I'm not sure if my eyes are playing tricks on me, but there's this guy on the other side of the room. I know I've seen him because he stops moving as I realize he's there. I'm getting concerned now. This is London, and not to make vast assumptions, but it's quite possible he has a knife. I shuffle along my bed slightly and he edges closer. I have to move now, and I think I may need to make it to the nearest door. I stand and make my way towards him, heart pumping for a fight. A couple of steps in, I get this feeling that this isn't right and I'm missing something. My eyes adjust a little more. I take half a step more and my eyes focus a little more, and then bam. I realize I'm not staring at another guy. I'm staring at myself. What I thought was someone else was just my reflection in a full-length mirror that was filthy near the door. I literally almost perished at the thought of my own reflection.
When I was 4, my dad finally managed to get a house with my stepmom. It was a great accomplishment. My stepmom was happy about the accomplishment. That was until she realized that I was a bit more than she expected. She asked me if I disliked the house. Through her words, my response shook her to her core instead of answering her question. I looked her dead set into her eyes and said in an unwavering manner, "The house is haunted. which was strange being that I was only 4, and I didn't really believe her, that is until I read her facial expressions. There was no indication of lying or making things up, which discomforts me still. Nonetheless, my dad at the time tried to shrug off my words and thought that I was just joking in an attempt to uplift my stepmom's excitement. For the next 5 years, I would grow up in that house with discomfort every time I slept in. I didn't feel like I was alone. I would grow up suspicious. It was until I felt like I was being watched that it would cause me to flee from my room in distress at the dead of night, crawling to my father in fear. He would shrug it off, claiming that I was just paranoid or tired, and that it would be the cause of me experiencing such things. My stepmom would always wake up to the feeling of being watched, and some nights would flee to the living room area near the front door and fall asleep on the couch. Dad believed that it was just hormones kicking in due to her soon being a mother. Before my stepmom gave birth to my first little sister, I had an experience. I woke up one night feeling the need to wee. I climbed out of bed and did my business, and came back only to stop when I realized that my window was open. I didn't know if it was open before, but what really made my stomach drop was the feminine black figure. I didn't move. I felt like if I did, something terrible would happen. So I didn't. After a small while, I bravely took a step, and it snapped its head at me, and the dark figure zoomed under the bed, and I broke out in tears. I ran to my dad and slept with him. I don't remember the rest of the night, but when I woke up, I saw a trail of throw-up leading to the bathroom from my spot. Then my stepmom gave birth to a baby girl. Then there was another experience before my younger sister was born. It was during the summer. We were getting ready to go to the lake. I was confused though because I heard a bunch of banging outside in the backyard and began looking around. I found my dad and asked him if he was okay. Turns out he wasn't the source of the banging. I would have to continue the searching. If it wasn't for my father calling for me to help get water, the backyard was suddenly on fire. I was so scared, but my stepmom got a hold of the fireman. I swore to God when fleeing, I saw another dark feminine figure waving. Soon enough, my stepmom gave birth again to a girl. The last straw of the house for me was when I encountered dark male figures in a lampshade, and I thought I saw a chair moving. I screamed and ran downstairs to tell my parents in tears and snot, all while tripping down the stairs. My dad did research on the house with people who were familiar with these types of things. Next thing I know, we moved out, and I was told to never tell my sisters why we really moved. But now that I'm watching them grow up, their two figures and shadows remind me of the two black feminine figures which I encountered in that house. I don't really believe in ghosts, but I had an experience a few months ago which gives me doubt. It was about 2 a.m, and I was sitting alone at the desk charting. In my peripheral vision, I saw a lady standing at the desk and I jumped a little. I looked over and there was just a vase with flowers. A few minutes later it happened again, and I figured that the flowers were just messing with my tired brain. So I moved them behind a desk. A few minutes later though, I jump again, because I swear I saw a figure standing there out of the corner of my eye. I just thought I was tired and on edge. But then one of the aides walks down the hall and rounds the corner and gasps. She says, "I just saw a woman standing there, but she's now gone." So that was strange. There's an old story from that unit about how during a change of shift, a patient flatlined on the telemonitor and everyone ran into the room. The patient was unresponsive and barely had a palpable pulse. Turns out her glucose was less than 20. They straightened her out, and once everything was settled, they realized the patient was not in the telemonitor and had never even had the telly on. I'm a nurse that works in an intensive care unit, I took care of a patient who had a history of esophageal cancer. A while back he had a surgery and got better, and eventually went home. Months later he got pneumonia and came back to the hospital in respiratory distress. He had to be put on a mechanical ventilator. He was stable, no blood pressure issues, heart rhythm looked great, breathing wasn't terrible, responsive and following commands. When all of a sudden his blood pressure suddenly drops and he lost his pulse. We called a code blue and began CPR. We brought him back after an hour and continued to run tests to figure out why he crashed. None of the results of the labs or imaging were remarkable. 15 minutes after we had brought him back, his blood pressure drops again and he lost pulse. We continued coding him for another hour until it was clear he couldn't be brought back, and the doctor pronounced him dead. His wife came in after the fact. She told me she couldn't stop thinking about the conversation her and her husband had. Wife: honey, don't forget you've got an appointment with the home health nurse this Saturday. Husband: well, I won't be here this Saturday. What do you mean you won't be here this Saturday? Where are you going? Oh, I don't know. I just won't be here. This conversation happened on Wednesday. He was admitted to the hospital Thursday and he died on Friday at 11:30 p.m.
This happened about a year ago. I work at an upscale hotel in one of my state's most affluent suburbs. Like most hotels, we struggled badly during the coronavirus outbreak. Our rates had been slashed in half to get guests through the doors, and our clientele had shifted from upper-crusty business people to a mixed bag of characters. It's mostly been fine with a couple of notable exceptions earlier on in the pandemic. Cut to the night I was working. I work alone overnight, 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. About 3 hours into my shift, I get a call from room 235. He has a strange voice. It's quiet, raspy, and perhaps a hint of an accent. He tells me he can't figure out how to work the remote in his room. I assume that the batteries could have died, but he insists the remote works fine. He just doesn't understand how to operate the volume button. I find this strange. I've worked in hotels for 5 years, and I've never once encountered someone who didn't understand the TV remote. I give him the benefit of the doubt. The volume button is like the Guitar Hero strum switch. You have to press a single switch up or down to navigate. Also, working in customer service, you do come to realize that people are much, much dumber than you want to believe they are. Since I'm alone at the hotel and technically not supposed to leave the front desk, I tell him that if he comes down to the lobby, I will gladly show him how it works. This upsets him, and he grunts and starts complaining that our customer service is terrible, and what kind of hotel wouldn't have an attendant come to the room for something like this? I give in. He's only 1 floor up, and I can't possibly take very long to show someone how to change the volume on a remote. Everyone has checked in. It's not worth the argument or the bad review later, and I tell him I'll be up in just a moment. I knock on his door and do the customary call-out. Guest services. I can faintly hear him talking to someone, but it's muttered, and I can't pick out any distinguishable words. At first it felt like he was instructing someone else to get the door, and I anticipated it opening shortly after. The talking went on for so long that I wondered if maybe the people in the room hadn't heard me. I was debating knocking again when the deadbolt slowly unlatched. Normally when I go into a room, the guest opens the door wide and stands to the side to let me in, or at the very least opens the door enough so that I can fully see them and they can fully see me. Not 235. He barely cracks the door. It's open maybe an inch. Even weirder, all the room lights are off. It's entirely dark except for the very faint glow of his TV, which is on but with the volume turned all the way down. His voice sounds exactly like it had on the phone, raspy and whispered. He's standing behind the door, so I can't see him at all. Completely disembodied, he instructs me, "Come on, come inside, sweetie." I say nothing and don't move. I guess now is the part where I tell you I'm a smallish 5-foot woman with a baby face in my mid-20s. "Come on, come inside." He sounds more edgy, more insistent this time. It felt so obvious like a trap that if I wasn't absurdly on edge, I would have been insulted. How naive does he think I am? I push the door open but remain as much in the hallway as possible. I take the opportunity to reach for the light switch just inside the door. The room lights up, and I finally get a look at him. He is at least 60, white-haired and slim, but with a little gut. He's shirtless, is wearing pants, but his belt is undone, and the ends are flopping down. I'm not entirely sure, because I try not to look, but I believe his pants are also unzipped. He appears to be completely alone in the room. The only piece of luggage is a small black duffel bag. I try to explain the volume switch from where I'm standing awkwardly in the doorway, but he isn't comprehending at all. Or at least he's acting like he isn't. I ask him to give the remote to me so that I could show him, but he backs further into the room. "You know, it'd be easier for both of us if you just come inside." For a brief moment, I think I see his eyes glimmer. I made it through the night. My boss was very concerned and felt badly and apologized if he had ever made me feel like I had to go up to the guest rooms, while alone, at the property, and made it clear he wants us to never do that again. For the record, no one has made me feel like I have to do it. All of the front desk staff do it from time to time. I usually don't unless it's one of our regulars who just needs a new roll of toilet paper or something. I did in this instance because it seemed like it would be quick, and while he sounded weird on the phone and I hated his voice, I didn't expect it to go as it did. You encounter a lot of weird people working in lodging. Usually I feel like I can tell the benign from the malignant. Obviously it was a bad call on my part and I was wrong in this case and I learned my lesson. As for not calling the police or my boss right then and there, I felt like I was potentially going to be in harm's way while I was standing in the doorway and he was actively being a creep. But when I got downstairs to my lockable office with my security cameras, which would have allowed me to see him coming, I was just really anxious and on high alert. I had decided that if he called again, I obviously wasn't going up, and if he came to the desk I would have 911 punched in my cell just in case. We were 2 minutes from the police station, and there's usually a patrol car hanging around in our shopping centre. They're quick to show up any time I had to call. Also, I'd like to think critically before I call the police for any reason. I've called them on someone for being similarly as weird, but in a slightly different way, and was told that unfortunately he hadn't technically done anything wrong, and to call back if he did. I don't believe it would have gotten me anywhere. I didn't call my general manager because he lives 45 minutes away, and I'm not sure what he could have done. Anyway, thank you all for your concern. I just wanted to share that you need to be careful while working, because you never know how creepy these people can get. You really don't want to get into a bad situation just for work.
I've had a pretty traumatizing death happen in a room. My first code. Nothing we could have done. For a few weeks I got a creepy feeling like I was being watched around that room. Cut to now 3 months later, and that room is empty, and I need to use the computer since the others are taken. We walk in, and then I literally yelped and jumped because I thought I saw someone sitting in the recliner in the room. Then, as I was charting, I kept feeling like someone was behind me watching me. So I leave, talk to my co-workers, and we stupidly decide to download ghost radar apps, which I know are not anything reliable, but 3 separate apps all picked up an entity in the room, when they didn't pick it up anywhere else. One picked out the word wish, and then another picked up a form outside the door that looked like it was looking at me. I don't normally believe in ghosts, I'm not religious, but after this night I felt so scared and like I needed to go to church. Others have had patients tell me they feel a dark presence in a room where someone has died. Call lights go off when there aren't patients. A lady in white is often seen on camera, but the nurses never see her even though they're right in front of them. Lots of scary stories. It's a surgery center, so people aren't expected to die. But it does leave a lot of bad juju when it does happen. When I was about 15, I had to get in some volunteer time to look good for college apps down the road. My family has a bunch of doctors and nurses, so I was shuffled pretty quickly into volunteering at the Utah University Hospital. I was a flower girl. Essentially, I trucked around the hospital and delivered flowers to patients. I believe it was floor 5 at the point, but it was the psych ward. Oftentimes, families wouldn't know why their loved one was in the hospital if they were in the psych ward, so would send flowers. I don't think many of the patients were allowed them because I had to deliver them to the front desk and not to the rooms. I'd have to wait at the desk so the nurse could double-check the patient was there. So a few weeks into working, I'm doing my rounds, and there are a lot of flowers for the psych ward this time. So I go and deliver and wait for the nurses to double-check everything. As I'm waiting, this bearded old dude with the creepiest smile I've ever seen is wheeled in from somewhere else in the hospital, with an escort that had a gun. The patient looks directly at me and we lock eyes. He politely asks me if I know God. Before we lost eye contact, I turn around and the nurses are all pale and hellish and rush me out of there as soon as possible. Found it weird until I saw his face later again that night on the TV during news. Dude was the guy who had kidnapped Elizabeth Smart, and while I am not the stereotypical platinum blonde Mormon girl, I'm a skinny mini with dirty blonde hair and blue eyes, so I'm sure he was more than happy to see me.
In 2019, me, my boyfriend, my best friend, and her partner stayed at an Airbnb in Sandusky, Ohio for a convention. There were several red flags about the place, but it was much cheaper than the hotel near the convention hall, so we opted to stay there. The first red flag happened when we arrived. The owner greeted us and made a point to tell us that his house was directly next door, as in, if there weren't any trees, he would have been able to see into the window of where we were staying. Okay. So he had a few houses on his property. No big deal. Right? Wrong. It only gets worse from here. Per instructions, we were forbidden to go into the basement under any circumstances unless there was a tornado. Being the curious young adults we are, we opened the door anyway, and were going to investigate, but stopped in our tracks as soon as we saw the direction of the stairs were facing directly towards the owner's home. In the darkness, there was a faint electronic glow. We quickly shut the door and barricaded it with luggage. Again, the owner's home was so close, there could have easily been something connecting his house to this basement. A little weirded out at this point, we went and looked at the rest of the house. It was a nice and spacious place, with a narrow staircase to the second floor, where our bedrooms would be. We selected our rooms, and began to unwind after the long drive. In my boyfriend and I's room, there was a single random sprinkler in the middle of the ceiling that looked out of place. We were tired from the trip, so we didn't think much of it then. But looking back now, there's a good chance it was a hidden camera. Things only got weirder from here. We were gone most of the next day at the convention, and when we returned, one of the outside doors that we definitely locked was unlocked and slightly ajar. My friends and I collectively shared a look of panic and closed and locked the door. My best friend's partner suggested that maybe the owner needed to get something out of there while we were gone, and didn't close the door completely on the way out. We made sure all of our things were still there, and then soon forgot about it because we discovered something more pressing. The locks on both the bedroom doors were now ineffective. We told ourselves that they were already like that, and that perhaps we just didn't notice them, but I'm not sure I believed that. On our second to last night, my boyfriend and I were both restless over what had been happening at the Airbnb and the day's activities, so we decided to try and find something to watch on TV to take our minds off it. We were flipping through the channels on the TV when suddenly we came across a Windows 10 lock screen and no computer in sight. I opened the cabinets and looked around trying to find a computer. The dresser the TV was on was too heavy to move, but seeing where the wires were positioned, they could have very well gone through the wall and into the basement. We were too frightened to see the basement for ourselves to confirm or deny our suspicions of surveillance, the owner's interference, and who knows what else. Needless to say, we left as quickly as possible on the last day and didn't look back. What do you guys think? Were we being spied on the whole time? We left a review, but of course, it didn't go anywhere.
My great-grandmother and her two sisters were very close. In fact, they passed away in the same year, in the exact same order of birth. Aunt Mary, Grandmother June, and Aunt Sally. Well, right before Aunt Sally died, we went to visit her in the nursing home. She was pretty far gone, having late-stage Alzheimer's, so she had been bedridden and unable to speak for 2 or 3 years. We did our usual visit of sitting and talking to her. We stayed about 2 hours, then left. We get a call the next day from her nurse to tell us that she had passed in the night, but told us something strange. She said that she went to check on her around 1 in the morning, but as she got to the door, she heard my aunt speaking, saying, "Mary, do I look okay? What do you think, June? Am I ready?" But when she went in, Aunt Sally was still laying in the bed, but she had a soft smile on her face. Her nurse came back in 2 hours later, and she had passed. I am a nurse, and generally work night shift, although I've never experienced any weirdness. And, come to think of it, I did work on an ex-tuberculosis wing. Before I worked at that hospital, I worked at an Alzheimer's facility. We had a patient that passed away, and I had a co-worker tell me that alarms would go off, the doors would slam, lights, you name it. So one night I go down that wing. The only patient in it had been the one that had passed, and it was built a few months prior. I'm restocking and the lights turn out, and a door slams. I come out angry and head back to the nurse's station to find the girls had no idea, but they told me so. I called a friend that had been sensitive to that stuff and asked to come and just walk around with me. She came and I gave her no context. I just told her it was weird. She walked through the entire building and came up to the very room that had been haunted, and she nailed it down to a T. She explained the person who didn't like that her chair was missing. She meant no harm and just felt very territorial to the room. The girls at the nurse's station were ecstatic. They weren't crazy and were ecstatic. It was the only patient that had been in that room, and as I walked, my friend, she pointed out to the windows so that I could see the girls where the nurses were at the station, and then pointed to the room on the far side of the facility where there was a light on in the room we had just left, and there was a clear silhouette in the window. Still makes me weirded out in a good way. Now, back to work in the freaking hospital. We also have a tunnel system and scary Silent Hill Hall rooms with archaic medieval devices. Why has nothing even remotely spooky happened to me is baffling. The details my friend gave were a woman with short hair in her 80s named Cleo. And as for my friend being sensitive to stuff, she's always had weird reactions, like if sensing something can walk into a room and will break out in hives almost instantly. I had lived in a house where she had spent nights over multiple times and never a problem, and I removed my Nana's hope chest out, and on that particular occasion I just felt weird stuff happen over the weekend. Tarot cards spiraled on the floor, candles aligned in bookshelves, etc. She came over, barely stepped in, broke out in the rash, and told me she wasn't welcome. Before we got to my room, she asked me what I took out of the house, and that I shouldn't have played with my tarot deck I picked up. I told her that I'd got some tarot cards and had been playing them for about a week. In the process of this, a bunch of coats and hangers came down from my makeshift closet on top of her. She left, told me she wasn't welcome, and told me to bring whatever was taken out back immediately. And to this day I still have my Nana's chest in my bedroom. I worked as the unit secretary at a hospital for almost 2 years, and asked to work weekend graveyards because it worked best with my school schedule. I saw a guy who got hit by a car going at 45 in a 25 while he was walking home from the library. Half of him went through the windshield before he flipped over the car and slid down the street. He was barely alive, but was a bloody pulp from his head to his stomach, and his face was gone. He passed within a few minutes. I also had a guy come in that was stabbed 9 times, but was so high and drunk, all he wanted to do was to fight the cop who brought him in. He wouldn't quit yelling and spitting on him or letting anyone touch him, so they couldn't find any records or get his blood type. They finally just sedated him and stabilized him before life-flighting him to another hospital. Anytime kids or babies pass is absolutely brutal. This happened before I was a doctor, but there was a lady on the psych ward who had really severe postpartum depression and ended up taking the life of her child. She wound up having a persistent psychotic state as a result, and subsequently was totally out of it. Some douche therapist thought that giving her a baby doll to help her grieve may fix things. Anyway, for the next few weeks she'd take care of the doll like it was real. I worked nights, and one of our responsibilities was to rotate the linens out for the patients. To do this, we had a big cabinet on wheels with locked swinging doors on the side. My buddy goes to change out the linens, and when he opens the door, the baby doll swings out, hanging by the sheet from its neck. It was easily one of the most unsettling things I'd ever seen. When I was in college, I met this dude called Steve. He was good-looking, well-spoken and confident, and was instantly well-liked by most of the people that he met. But he was a bit intimidating to me at first, due to the fact that he was pretty jacked and didn't speak to me a whole lot in the beginning. Here I am, an 18 going on 19-year-old fat kid with an inferiority complex that made me act out to get attention. I would wear women's clothes to class to get a laugh, or interrupt the professor with a witticism here and a joke there for the laugh. I was that kid, the one people didn't exactly dislike but weren't too eager to hang out with, because I could be a bit much at times. This did nothing to help with my feelings of inadequacy, but I didn't make the connection there until a few years later. Steve and I didn't exactly become fast and hard friends, because I got pretty drunk at a party once and he decided instantly that I was annoying. But we were still civil to each other, as we were in the same department and had a number of classes together. We hung out with different crowds too, even inside the department. Steve had recently been kicked out of boot camp in the military. He told everyone it was because he had injured himself badly enough that he had been discharged. That wasn't true, but we'll get to that later. Cut to about 4 months after me first meeting Steve, and I have been invited by a mutual friend Corey to come to a small get-together at his place, where he incidentally was roommates with Steve. I told Corey that I was kind of wary of Steve and felt that he didn't like me, to which he replied that I was right, and that's why he wanted me to come over. He wanted Steve and I to get to know each other, because he was positive we could become friends if we gave each other a shot, and after some prodding I finally agreed. When I arrived at Corey's house, there were maybe 3 other people from the department there. It seemed like a pretty chill setting. There was some alcohol being passed around, and I drank a small amount, but kept my distance from Steve. After a few hours and quite a few beers, I was starting to feel pretty good. Someone brought out a few joints, and those started getting passed around too. When one of them made its way to me, Steve spoke up. "Don't bother passing to him," he said with a mocking laugh. "He's a goody-goody." I'm not sure exactly why he said that, even though I thought that I may have once mentioned in passing that I'd never done weed before, but regardless of why he said it, it made me mad that he was making fun of me. So I did what any 19-year-old drunk dude would do. I grabbed the joint and took the biggest hit anyone could possibly take. This, for anyone who has ever smoked knows, is a huge mistake for a marijuana virgin, when quality kush is handed to him. After my coughing fit, and the laughter that ensued at my expense, I looked at Steve challengingly, and he just nodded in my direction before resuming in his conversation. Now, no one told me that you shouldn't mix weed and alcohol. Had I stopped there, I would have been fine. However, I continued to drink, which worsened everything that came with being high. By the time I knew I was high, I was starting to get paranoid. I am, or at least was, a bit of a hypochondriac. Dry mouth felt like my tongue was swelling up, and my throat was starting to close. The feeling of almost weightlessness that sometimes accompanies being high made me feel like I wasn't anchored to the floor anymore. The time dilation that you experience with weed made me feel like I was frozen in time, and I began to panic. By this point, everyone else had gone home, and it was just me, Steve, and Corey. I explained to Corey that I thought I was allergic to weed because I wasn't feeling right, and oddly enough, Steve explained to me to ask what I was feeling. When I did, he walked me through all of it and calmed me down. Once I was calm, he put a controller in my hand, and we played video games until I sobered up enough to drive. It was honestly really cool of him, and it was the start of one of the best friendships I've ever had, until it became the worst and most abusive relationship I've ever been in. Over the next year or so, Steve and I became really close. I considered him one of my best friends. Being around him was almost like a drug. He just had this way of making you feel like you mattered. I know now that he was a complete sociopath, but you don't really see the signs until it's far too late. He harassed me until I started working out with him, which meant I had more energy and confidence in myself, and got into pretty decent shape. I wasn't ripped, I wasn't even what most people would call fit, but I wasn't the fat kid anymore either. He would come to my house and force me to go out to do stuff. Before I became friends with him, I was kind of a loner and a hermit. We would go to the lake just to dick around or go hiking in the woods or any number of outdoorsy type activities, and for the first time in years I had confidence in myself and was actually quite happy. Enter Lisa, the love of my life, the one who got away, or rather the one that I stupidly dumped twice over a 5-year relationship because I was scared. She's not a huge part of this story, but she plays a role. She had come to my hometown to go to school, and had a boyfriend back home, but we clicked immediately. I know you're wondering, and no, we didn't hook up or anything while she was with him. She made her intentions towards me clear, and I made it clear that nothing would happen while she was dating someone else. She told me she had been considering breaking things off with him, as he was a bit controlling and dickish, and the next day she walked up to me and kissed me full on the mouth, and when I started to push her away, she informed me that they had broken up, and that is how our relationship began. I just would like to let you know that this has nothing to do with Steve, but it was an immensely happy time for my life, and I never would have had the confidence to flirt with Lisa in the first place if it wasn't for Steve. The next year after Lisa and I got together was rather uneventful. I will admit there were some red flags with Steve, that I didn't either see or just outright ignored. Looking back on it now, one of the most obvious was that one day I was hanging out with Lisa when Steve showed up. She had always gotten a bad vibe from him, and rightly so. And so when he showed up, she left to go to class 45 minutes early. Watching her walk away, Steve said, "I could take her from you if I wanted." I gave him an incredulous look, slightly panicking that this man who called himself my friend might actually want to, and be able to sway Lisa to date him instead of me. He laughed at my expression and added, "Don't worry, I don't want her. She's a 6 at best, but she's perfect for you. But I prefer my girls a little thinner and much hotter. Just thought you should know that if I wanted to, I could." It should be noted that Lisa was thin, if curvaceous and absolutely gorgeous in a very classical way. I'm now convinced that Steve was actually attracted to her, but he saw himself as the alpha and needed to assert his dominance over me as one of his perceived betas. I'm ashamed to admit that it worked. I did get angry and told him not to talk about my girlfriend in such a gross way, but once he gave a half-hearted apology, I just kind of shrugged it off. The next year, the red flags came up even more, which I chose to ignore. But the first few years weren't really that bad. Steve was starting to show his true colors, but the real horrible stuff was still to come. Also, if you're keeping track, I was at a 2-year college for 3 years. That's just how long it took me to get my associate's degree. That's neither here nor there. Steve started dating one of the freshmen in our department. I heard from others that the relationship was incredibly psychologically abusive on his end, but I kept brushing it off because the girl he was dating hadn't spoken up and Steve was a good guy, right? I mean, I hadn't witnessed it. Other people must have just misinterpreted Steve's unusual sense of humor in a way that painted him in a bad light. I was unaware at the time that of course she wouldn't speak out against him because that's exactly what psychological abuse is. It's gaslighting and insults and ensuring that the victim believes themselves to be absolutely worthless and deserving of the treatment that they receive. During the end of the year departmental party, I proposed to Lisa and she said yes. And when Lisa and I graduated from the college with an associate's degree, we decided to move to a new school together. Despite the fact that our relationship grew stronger than ever without Steve in our lives, a dot that didn't connect due to still being firmly in his psychotic grasp, the college we decided to transfer to was absolute garbage, and after a year there, we decided to transfer again to a better and cheaper school this time about an hour away. Coincidentally, it was the same school that Steve now attended. That summer, Lisa moved back to her hometown while transitioning between schools, and I ended things with her for the first time over the phone. Shitty, I know. But we were like 5 hours apart, since I had stayed behind to live on campus and work, and neither of us could find the time to visit each other. The only reason I can logically come up with this is that I was scared of the commitment. I've always said that when I marry I want it to be for life, and I got in my own head and started to worry about whether or not Lisa was the person I really wanted to spend the rest of my life with. When I moved to the new city, Steve helped me get an apartment in the same complex where he and Corey, the friend from earlier, both lived. We were in separate buildings, but the apartments were set up in a way that the courtyard between the two buildings was only like 40 feet across. I could actually see into Steve's apartment window from my second floor one when we both had our blinds open. There were many times that I would glance out the window while playing video games or something like that, and Steve would catch my eye and wave over to me. I would immediately turn my game off and head over to his place to smoke a little weed and watch one of his 4 DVDs for the billionth time. During this time in my life, I became a major alcoholic, and I'm fairly certain that Steve realized this was happening, but said nothing because he wanted to be able to hold it over me. He may have contributed to my alcoholism a tiny bit. He began to use the same bullying tactics he had once employed to get me to go work out and do things. This time he was using them to get me to go out drinking. If I told him I had class early the next day or homework that needed doing, he would just wave it off and tell me that we would be back in plenty of time to get it done. We would often stay out till 2 in the morning when the bars closed, or later if he met someone cool and decided that we were going to go to their house to hang out for a bit. If I said I didn't have money, he would promise to pay for me, and at the end of the night, I would get a bill I could barely afford, and he would explain that clearly he meant he would pay for the first couple of rounds, and if I drank more it was my fault. Several times I actually had to have him lend me money just to pay rent, which further put me in his clutches. I would like to take a brief break and address the elephant in the room. I realized that every single one of the previous mentioned problems stemmed from me. I could have moderated my drinking. I could have told him no when he asked me to go out, and I could have realized sooner that he was never truly going to pay my bar tab, or that we weren't going to be home early. And I do take responsibility for all of these things. But that being said, something you have to understand about Steve is that he would gaslight and make me feel like I was being a bad friend if I told him no, despite having a very valid reason for the refusal. What I'm trying to do by telling you this part is point out that he was never the good friend I thought he was. Or he would have pointed out that I was drinking too much. Would it have stopped me? As I know now from the numerous attempts by another true friend, no, it really wouldn't have. But at least in hindsight, I would be able to say, you know what, Steve tried to stop me drinking. He was a good friend. But back to this story. Some few months after moving into the new city, Steve introduced me to a friend of his from out of town, Jennifer. She was a pretty woman with dyed red hair, styled in a pixie cut, thin, and an athletic build with a gorgeous face. She was honestly every straight man's dream. Not only that, but she was intelligent, funny, quick-witted, and compassionate and kind. And I got a bit of a crush on her, but she was way out of my league. I asked Steve if she was seeing anyone, because at this point I still had some confidence. He told me she wasn't, and asked if I liked her. I said I did, and he assured me that he would try and get a feel for what she thought of me. Cut to a few days later, and Steve is now dating her. This confused the hell out of me because when he introduced us, they kept making jokes about how neither of them were really interested in the other, and they would never work as a couple. I think even back then, I knew he had done his psychological messing stuff to get her to date him, so he could once again assert his dominance over me. I shrugged it off, happy that my friend had found a girl to make him forget that freshman he had been dating a few years back. He had constantly moaned about missing her when she finally got the courage to tell him to go do one night after he called her fat. She was maybe 95 pounds. Over the next few weeks, I started to notice that Jem was looking more and more exhausted and haggard. When I asked if she was okay, she would just smile and assure me that her workloads were just getting with her. We had started to become friends, so I asked her not to hesitate in coming to me if there was anything I could do to help. She thanked me for the gesture, but again said she was fine. I would find out later that Steve was treating her in the same way he had treated his previous girlfriend. She apparently told Steve about my offer for help, thinking it was sweet and that I wanted to help her. And as you may have guessed, Steve flew over the handle. I'd never seen him get so angry. He came to my apartment, banged on the door and almost broke it down, screaming at me to get my two-faced ass out into the hallway so that he could kill me. I didn't know it at the time, but Steve had started taking steroids, which explained, to some extent, his unfound rage. After nearly an hour of him pacing in my living room and threatening me and yelling loud enough to wake the whole damn neighborhood, I was finally able to convince him that my intentions were nothing but friendly towards Jen. Bro code. Dictated that even if two of them broke it off, I wasn't going to be pursuing her, since she had dated one of my best friends. Once he finally believed that I wasn't trying to stuff his girl like a Thanksgiving turkey, as he put it, it was like a switch flipped. Suddenly we were best friends again, and his earlier rage seemed to have been forgotten, almost as if it had never happened. He dumped Jen shortly after. My guess is that he realized he had no romantic interest in her anymore, and therefore couldn't use his relationship with her to needle me and control me. I only saw her a handful of times after that, but the last time I saw her she looked so much happier. Yet another sign about Steve I didn't see or chose to ignore. About a month later, Lisa and I got back together. She was incredibly distrustful and wary of me at this point, and rightly so. I had broken her heart for no other reason than I was an idiot. Over time, she began to trust me with her emotions again. This was a mistake on her part, and I don't mean that to sound cruel. Perhaps I had picked up a few things from Steve. I know that I was fairly manipulative. I am much more ashamed of that now than I can ever portray in words, and I hate myself for the way I treated her during our second stint as a couple. Lisa was still uncomfortable around Steve, and would often leave if we were hanging out. He never seemed to catch on that she didn't want to be around him. Things were made far worse when we went to a house party one night and Steve groped her. Again, I'm incredibly ashamed to admit of what I did when she came to me in tears of rage and disgust and told me what had happened. I'm ashamed because the first thing out of my mouth was, "Steve wouldn't do that. Maybe you misunderstood what was going on. He smacked my ass and grabbed my chest," she practically yelled at me. "All right, I'll go talk to him." I should have just cut him off right then and there. I should have taken Lisa home. I should have went to knock Steve out. I should have done a whole lot of things. But I've always been a people pleaser, and Steve brought this out of me in the worst way. When I asked him about it, he told me that he had grabbed her waist to get around her in the kitchen as it was crowded, and that he had accidentally brushed past her breast while reaching for a bottle of rum. And I ate that up. I believed him, and I went back to Lisa and conveyed what had just been told to me. After a lot more enraged tears and yelling, she left. Why she just didn't dump my stupid harassment, apologetic, victim-blaming ass right there, I still don't know. And when Steve appeared a few minutes later, and I explained what happened, he put on a faux sympathetic face and said with a chuckle, "Man, screw that girl. Let's find you a hot, drunk girl who wants to give you a BJ." Even though I knew that that was a huge red flag, and that I did not want to do anything with anyone, I still ignored the signs. I didn't cheat, but I ignored the signs, and Lisa didn't speak to me for a week, and she was right to do so. I think she should have never spoken to me again. Things with Steve were a bit strained and we didn't hang out that much. Things with Lisa improved as Steve wasn't around, and we were talking even about moving in together. This would not ever happen, because I was going to break up with her again before long. I didn't know I was going to do it this time, but it was going to happen, and when it did, there were no tears like the last time, there was no pleading like we could make it work. Lisa simply fixed me in a motionless, almost dead gaze and said, "My sister told me not to trust you again. I should have listened. Get your stuff and get out." Now I really wish she had just left it at that. But over the next few years, we would go on to just have a few stints as friends with benefits. And that just about sums up what became of our relationship, friendship, or facsimile of friendship after a while. Shortly after our breakup, I became immensely depressed. I didn't realize that it was because I was still in love with Lisa. Why would I be? I had broken things off with her. Regardless, I started drinking even more and stopped working out, and started regaining all the weight I had lost in my freshman year of college. Steve noticed, regarding that I was a fat turd. I never really minded it because I was used to my weight being the butt of every other joke. Besides, he always said it with a laugh to let me know that he was only joking. The way good friends always insult each other, right? At the same time, I started hanging out with him again. One day he came to me asking if I wanted to move into a house with him, and I politely declined because I liked living alone, and my rent was relatively cheap for where I lived. He obviously called me some names and got unreasonably angry, saying that I owed him everything. He then screamed at me for half an hour and didn't speak to me for 3 days, but did eventually calm down. He never apologized for his outburst though, and when he moved out, another mutual friend took his apartment after having just gone through a bad breakup of his own, and I started hanging out with his new friend Mark quite a bit, since he lived just across the courtyard and Steve was a few miles away. During this time I met a man through Mark who would go on to become one of my 2 best friends that I had ever met. Enter Nick. Remember the friend from earlier who I said regularly tried to get me to stop drinking? That's Nick. He was and is a man who, for some reason, I never want to disappoint. Even today, being mostly sober, a huge part of what keeps me from drinking is the idea that if Nick ever found out, I would be more ashamed of myself than if I publicly crapped my pants in front of the woman of my dreams. Personally, to me, that's a mark of true friendship, mostly because Nick never asked or expected anything of me. In fact, I think he's a little uncomfortable to be with, but not something I can just turn off. Nick and I hit it off fairly quickly and started hanging out regularly. It was with Nick and his circle of friends, all of whom I now proudly know as my own friends, that a Dungeons & Dragons group was started that lasted for nearly 4 years. Nick plays a bigger, if not huge, part in this story later. Things continued in this way for maybe half a year before I finally decided to take Steve up on his offer and move into the house with him, mostly because money was tight and my bills would go down. His current roommates had moved away for whatever reason, and he had a few vacancies. I took one room, and a friend of his from when he was in boot camp, Greg, took the other. For a while, thinking things were awesome, Steve had apparently become Catholic. He was off the juice. It was like I had my old friend back from the days when we had started becoming chummy. He, Greg, and I would often go on road trips or just go out to bars or go to some outdoor attractions around the city and walk around. Now remember that I said Steve had been discharged for the military and claimed that it was due to an injury? Turns out it wasn't true at all. One night while Steve was at work, Greg and I were hanging out with some beers, and somehow the topic came up. "You know, he was just crazy, right?" Greg asked. "What do you mean?" "He got kicked out before he finished boot camp." "Really? He told me he suffered some kind of injury and they had to let him go." After I said this, an incredulous look came over Greg's face and he turned slowly to look at me. He told me that Steve had reason to suspect that his then wife was cheating on him and had been overheard by a commanding officer saying that when he's finished with boot camp he was going to go murder both of them and the daughter that he and his wife had. He had been given an in-depth psychological evaluation and been discharged essentially for being too insane for the military. I later confirmed this with some of Steve's childhood friends. At this point I was starting to realize who Steve really was, thinking back on some of the interactions I'd had with him. Unfortunately, I was stupidly loyal to someone I perceived to be a good friend. At some point, I had invited Nick to come over and hang out to play video games and whatnot, and when Steve met Nick, he immediately called him fat. Now, Nick was at the time a large man. He has since made enormous strides in his fitness journey. Shout out to Nick for all your hard work. If you're listening to this, you look great. And regardless, I remember the look of utter disbelief on Nick's face. But I defended Steve, saying that that's just how he made friends. If he wasn't calling you names, then it meant he didn't like you, lol. By the way, just as a side point, can we stop that? Treating people like crap is not a way to break the ice, it's terrible. And I'm guilty of doing this in the past, and I hate that I used to do it. Anyway, not relevant. I could tell Nick was skeptical, but he just kind of went with it. I think he kind of resented me for not defending him, but never said so. After a few weeks after the conversation with Greg, Steve had a friend of his from out of town stay with us for the weekend. Greg was out of town for some reason. But before Steve's friend arrived, he told me that she was fat, but pretty, and that if I wanted her, I had his blessing. This did not sit well with me because not only of how he described her, which I learnt wasn't true when she arrived, but because he felt the need to give his permission for two of his friends to have relations with each other. I kept my mouth shut though. I forgot the woman's name, but she was very pretty, curvaceous, but in no way fat. I was confused as to why Steve would describe her in this way. She and I got along really well from the start, and she and Steve slept together. Again, I'm fairly certain he slept with her because he could tell I was taking a liking to her. I wasn't falling over myself to get into a relationship with her, but I did think she was quite nice. Steve had to once again assert his dominance over me. The next day we all had lunch at a local restaurant, and Steve essentially left his friend and myself to drive his car back to the house while he wandered off to do God knows what. I was infuriated that he would do that. Not necessarily the leave us part, but the fact that his friend had come to town specifically to visit him and he just bailed on her with no reason. She and I spent the day watching movies and playing video games, and we talked quite a bit about Steve, as he was our one common link. And a lot of things came to light about Steve. I messaged him multiple times throughout the day asking where he was, and he didn't respond until about midnight. I sent a text telling him it was kind of crappy to just leave his friend with me, as she had come to see him, and the text I got back just read, "Mind your business, fatty, I'll be home when I get home." He finally rolled up around 10 the next morning when his friend was getting ready to leave. He was driving a motorcycle that I'd never seen before. He barely said goodbye to the woman as she was leaving, and when the door closed I rounded on him, asking where he was, feeling myself get angrier by the word. Not that it's any of your business, but I was helping a friend bury a body. He shot back as he walked into his room. I knew instantly that this was a lie. I just had this intuition when it came to Steve. I could almost tell when he was lying, and this one was just so outlandish that I didn't even need to consider it. "No, you weren't," I said under my breath. "What was that, fatty?" he said, coming back to me in the room shirtless, getting in my face. I gently pushed him away from me and he looked utter dumbfounded. He couldn't believe I would ever stand up to him like this. I said, "You're lying," I retorted quickly. "But if you want to treat your friends like crap, when they travel 4 hours just to hang out with you for a few days, be my guest." We stood there glaring at each other for a few seconds before he deflated and looked slightly ashamed, which shocked the hell out of me. "I was with a girl I've been dating," he said softly. "So you invited a friend to stay with us," I said, my anger rising again, "and cheated on your girlfriend with her and bailed on us and then lied to me about it? Screw you, douchebag." I turned on my heel and stormed to my room. I'm fairly certain Steve then threw a projectile at me but missed, because I heard a thump on the wall to my left of the doorway as I walked through it. I didn't stop to find out. I didn't speak to Steve for a few days after that, and it wasn't until Greg returned from his trip and noticed that we weren't spending time together and were acting coldly towards one another that our friendship started to repair a bit. Mostly due to Greg yelling at us that he wasn't going to live with a few girls who couldn't get their act together and act like adults. Despite our relationship repairing slightly, things were never really the same after that. Over the next few months, Steve started to sell drugs and always kept a loaded gun in the house. I specifically remember him telling me one day that some guy was going to be coming over to give him some money that he was owed, and if he showed up while Steve was at work, I was supposed to take the money, count it, and put it in his bedroom desk. I didn't know he was dealing at the time, and so assumed the guy just owed him money. I just agreed and went back to playing video games, as he left for work. Steve got home from work before the guy showed up, and when there was a knock at the door, Steve came out of his room with his gun in hand and held a finger to his lips. He opened the door to reveal a man standing in the porch with a wad of cash in his hand. Steve immediately pointed the gun in his face, cocked the hammer back and started screaming at him to drop the money on the ground and get off his porch. As the dude was fleeing in terror, Steve yelled at him that if he ever saw him again, he would end him. Of course, I was immediately distressed by what I had just witnessed, but I was equally terrified when he turned to me with a huge grin after collecting the money from the porch and closing the door. I just gave a weak smile and ignored the whole thing, and learned later that he was back on the steroids when this happened. During this time, Steve would regularly come home late at night, 3 sheets to the wind, ranting about one ethnic group or another. The one thing that sticks out in my mind the most was when he stumbled in so drunk that he could barely string together a coherent thought. He was yelling about globalism and how the Chinese were trying to take over the world. He mumbled a string of words I couldn't make out and then shouted, "Pingling!" followed by another string of unintelligible and crazy words, and finally, "Screwing our daughters," were the last words that left his lips, and he immediately fell to the floor and began to sob. I had no idea what to do. If I tried to help him, I knew he would get violent towards me. In the end, I did nothing and went to my room. A few weeks after that particularly charming incident, Steve and I got into an argument about something that I can't remember. He stormed off to his room and I thought it was over. I knew from experience that given time and distance he would calm down, but would never apologize. At least the situation would de-escalate, but I was wrong this time. 10 minutes later, he came crashing back into the living room, gun in hand, pointing to my face. He was yelling that if I didn't give him respect, that he may as well kill me. "You're not going to shoot me," I said far more calmly than I felt. Inside, I was crapping my pants, despite the fact I honestly did believe he wasn't going to shoot me. I had been around guns before, but had never had one pointed at me. "Yeah?" he said. "Why do you think that?" "I know it. You're not going to shoot me because I'm one of the few friends you've got left." He seemed to consider this for a moment and finally lowered the gun. His face was still murder incarnate, but at least the gun wasn't pointing at me. "Can you move, man? I'm trying to watch Netflix." He continued staring at me for a long time, seemingly trying to internally fight himself before finally stomping back to his room. I didn't see him again for the rest of the night. A few days later, Steve and Greg asked me to sit down when I came home from my 3rd double in a row at the restaurant where I worked. I asked why, and they said, "We need to talk about me living there." I told them there was no need. I was moving out. They seemed satisfied with this, and I went to my room to get some much-needed sleep. As a side note, as I was moving out, I accidentally broke the handle of the storm door and Steve lost his mind, screaming at me and calling me all kinds of names, including the M-word. I assured him that I would replace it, but he just kept calling me names. Nick was helping me move out at the time, and once we were away from the house, he gave me a look that spoke volumes. "I know," I said. This was the point that I finally snapped and realized that Steve was nothing but a toxic piece of crap. It took someone I hadn't known for very long giving me a single look for that puzzle piece to finally fall into place and make me go, wow, he's a bag of dicks. After I moved out, I only saw Steve once. I was coming out of my class at the university campus and he drove up on his motorcycle and started trying to make conversation, but I just made some lame excuse about needing to get to work or home or something and walked away. About a year later, I blocked Steve completely on all social media, where he commented on a Facebook post and called my mum something horrible. I don't know why I didn't do it sooner. About a year after that, Nick and I were at the mall. Being on a bit of time crunch and needing things from different stores, we decided to head in different directions and meet in the food court. I finished what I needed to do first and was standing in front of Dairy Queen waiting for Nick to meet me, when I get a phone call from him. "What's up?" I said by way of answering. "I just saw Steve," he said without preamble. He was going to the store I was coming out of. He didn't need to tell me which Steve. He knew most of the words I've put into this story by this point, although I'm sure some of these anecdotes would have surprised even him. My heart seemed to seize and I couldn't breathe. I hadn't seen or spoken to Steve in over 2 years, and the thought of coming face to face with him now filled me with dread. "Hello, you there?" "Yeah, I'll meet you at the car." That's why I told you I'll be out in a bit. I practically sprinted to the car and just kept praying to whatever gods may exist that Nick would be out soon. I went over and over in my mind what I would say if Steve did show up, but luckily I never had to find out, because Nick appeared pretty quickly and we left. That was the last I heard of him. These incidents that are portrayed in this story are not everything that happened over the course of my relationship with him. There were more, including more death threats, more physical altercations, more name-calling, and insurance fraud that Steve decided to rope me into without my knowledge. These were just the worst, or more poignant incidents that need to be told in order to paint Steve as he truly is. Were I to share the entire story of Steve, it would likely wind up being a whole novel. A lot of it, while terrible, isn't really that relevant in the grand scheme of things. So, there it is. I know at this point you're probably wondering, why didn't I just leave Steve in the dust a long time ago? Why didn't I just walk away from the friendship at the first sign of trouble? Well, there are a few reasons. First and foremost, Steve was a sociopath. They are extremely well versed in making people trust them, even as they treat them like trash. Not to mention he gaslit me, made me feel as though a lot of the smaller incidents were my fault, that in turn led me to believing the bigger problems were my fault too. This is how psychological abusers keep control. Secondly, I am a loyal friend to a fault. I will see the best in people I care about, even if they stab me in the back and beat me down. This is a fault of mine that I'm working on, and I only saw the terrible in Steve when he treated another friend I was loyal to like crap. A part of me was also terrified to walk away. There was a piece of me that was scared, and sometimes still is since I blocked him, that he would get it in his head to kill me because I rejected him. This is again part of the conditioning that abusers do, but regardless, I'm much happier now the whole thing is behind me. I'd like to end this on a final note. If you're in a relationship of any kind and you start to see red flags, don't ignore them like I did. I explained away a lot of the red flags that Steve was waving proudly, and I regret it to this day. I was lucky. I got out of the most toxic friendship I've ever known, with only some psychological trauma and having my confidence shattered. But it could have ended so much worse. If you need help getting out, seek it immediately. Leave everything behind if you have to. Things can be replaced, but you cannot be. Thanks for listening. And Steve, please stay away from me. I never want to see or hear from you again.